Marry a stranger in the next hour, or I take the farm. The judge's voice cut through the Nebraska courtroom like a blade. Clara Holloway stood there, 34 years old, widowed 3 weeks, and about to lose everything. The men surrounding her weren't offering help. They were circling like wolves, their eyes crawling over her body, their voices thick with mockery about her size, her desperation, her worthlessness. She was livestock at auction. Then a scarred drifter stepped from the shadows and said 5 words that changed everything. I'll pay her entire debt. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The courthouse smelled like old wood, tobacco spit, and something Clara couldn't name, maybe desperation, maybe rot. Hard to tell the difference anymore. She stood in front of Judge Callahan's bench with her hands clasped so tight her knuckles had gone white, trying not to shake, trying not to let them see how badly she wanted to run. 3 weeks since they'd buried Thomas. 2 weeks since the creditors started showing up at her door. 1 week since she'd stopped sleeping. Judge Callahan looked down at her over his reading glasses, his face carved from the same granite as the courtroom walls. Behind him, dust motes drifted through afternoon light that slanted hard and yellow through unwashed windows. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath. Mrs. Holloway, he said, and his voice had all the warmth of a January wind. The court has reviewed your late husband's financial affairs. The debts are substantial. The farm is collateral, barely covers half. Clara's throat tightened. She'd known it was bad. Thomas had hidden things from her. She'd figured that out after he died, going through papers she'd never been allowed to touch. But hearing it spoken aloud in this room full of men, all of them watching her like she was something pitiable and vaguely amusing, made her stomach twist. How much? She managed. $1,400.73. Someone in the gallery whistled low. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She'd been hoping, praying, if she were the praying type, that maybe it was $600-700, something she could work off somehow, eventually. But $1,400? She didn't have $1,400. Nobody she knew had $1,400. Your Honor, she started, and hated how small her voice sounded. I can work. The creditors aren't interested in payment plans, Mrs. Holloway. They want resolution today. Callahan shuffled the papers in front of him with the bored efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times. However, Nebraska territorial law does provide certain alternatives for widows in financial distress. Clara's mouth went dry. She knew what was coming. She'd heard about it happening to Sarah Brennan last year, and to that Swedish woman over in Willow Creek before that. The court recognizes that a woman alone cannot reasonably manage a working farm or satisfy debts of this magnitude. Callahan's tone suggested he was reading from a script he'd memorized years ago and never questioned. Therefore, you have 2 options. First, surrender all property to the creditors immediately and vacate the premises within 24 hours. Second, enter into marriage with a suitable man of sufficient means to assume your debts. Said marriage to be contracted and consummated within, he pulled out his pocket watch, 63 minutes. The gallery erupted, not in outrage, in laughter. Hell, I'll take her, someone called from the back. Farm's worth more than the woman, but I ain't picky. More laughter. Clara's face burned. She ain't much to look at, but land's land, another voice added. How fat you reckon she is under all them skirts? Fat enough she won't blow away in a dust storm, that's for damn sure. The room shook with crude amusement. Clara stood frozen, staring at the floor, willing herself not to cry, not to give them that satisfaction. Her fingers dug into her palms hard enough to leave marks. Judge Callahan banged his gavel once, half-heartedly. Order, gentlemen, please. But he was smiling a little, just enough that Clara could see it. Any serious offers? Callahan asked the room. A man in the second row stood up. Carl Driscoll owned the feed store in town, had a wife who died in childbirth 2 years back. He was 50 if he was a day, with yellow teeth and hands that always looked dirty. I'll take the obligation, Your Honor, Driscoll said, not looking at Clara. Assuming the property transfers clean and the woman understands her place. Noted. Anyone else? Hell, Carl, you just want something to warm your bed that won't cost you by the hour. The same voice from before. More laughter. Driscoll's face reddened, but he didn't sit down. Another man rose, Thomas Brennan, Sarah's widower. He'd remarried within a month of Sarah's forced wedding to a cattle trader. I'll offer, Your Honor. I've got the means, and I already know how to manage a reluctant wife. The way he said it made Clara's skin crawl. Callahan looked at her. Mrs. Holloway, you've heard two offers. You have, he checked his watch again, 58 minutes to accept one, or the farm goes to auction at 3 o'clock. What's your answer? Clara's mind was racing and blank at the same time. Both men were vile. Both would treat her like property they'd purchased at a discount. But losing the farm meant losing the only home she'd ever known, the only thing she had left of the life she'd tried to build. Thomas had been a bastard in his own ways, cold, secretive, sometimes cruel with his words. But he'd never hit her, never starved her. These men? She didn't know, couldn't know. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, tried again. I need to think. You've got 57 minutes to think, Callahan said. But I'll warn you, Mrs. Holloway, these gentlemen won't wait forever. Pride's expensive, and you can't afford it anymore. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Every head turned. A man stepped inside, and the quality of silence changed instantly. The mocking laughter died. Even the dust seemed to stop moving. He was tall, taller than anyone in the room, with shoulders that filled the doorway and a way of moving that reminded Clara of wolves she'd seen once, lean and hungry and completely sure of themselves. His coat was travel-stained, his boots worn but well-kept. Dark hair touched his collar, longer than decent men wore it. But it was his face that made people stare, hard-lined, scarred along the left cheekbone, with eyes that looked black in the dim light and seemed to take in everything without blinking. He wore two guns, not concealed, just there, low on his hips, like they belonged. Nobody in Harlan County wore two guns unless they'd killed enough people to need them. The man walked down the center aisle with slow, deliberate steps. His spurs made small, metallic sounds that seemed loud in the suffocating quiet. He didn't look at anyone except Clara, and when their eyes met, she felt something strange. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Like he saw her. Actually saw her. Not the desperate widow, not the fat woman the gallery was mocking, but her. You got business here, mister? Callahan's voice had lost some of its certainty. The stranger stopped a few feet from Clara. Up close, she could see his eyes weren't black. They were dark brown, almost amber in the light. There was a knife scar through his left eyebrow, another along his jaw. His hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed but ready. Heard you were auctioning off a woman, he said. His voice was quiet, rough-edged, with an accent Clara couldn't place. Southern, maybe, but worn down by years of travel. Figured I'd see if the rumors were true. This is a legal proceeding, Callahan said, recovering some of his authority. Not an auction. Mrs. Holloway is here to settle her late husband's debts through lawful matrimony, as prescribed by, how much? Callahan blinked. Excuse me? The debt. How much? $1,400.73, but I fail to see. The stranger reached into his coat. Every man in the room tensed. Clara saw hands moving toward hidden weapons, saw Callahan lean back in his chair. But what the stranger pulled out wasn't a gun. It was a bank envelope. He tossed it onto Callahan's bench. It landed with a heavy thud. $1,500, the stranger said. Cash. Pay her debts and file the deed in her name, clear and free. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Now wait just a goddamn minute. Driscoll was on his feet, face purple. You can't just walk in here and... Who the hell are you? Brennan demanded. Callahan was staring at the envelope like it might contain a snake. Sir, I don't even know your name. This is highly irregular. Riker Vale. The stranger, Riker, looked at Clara. And I'm making an offer for the lady's hand, assuming she'll have me. Clara couldn't breathe. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. This man was dangerous. Everything about him screamed it. But he was looking at her like she was a person who could make choices, not livestock being divided up. This is insane, she heard herself say. You don't even know me. Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Riker's mouth. You don't know me either, ma'am, but I suspect we're both better options than these gentlemen. He didn't raise his voice, but somehow the contempt in it carried through the whole room. And I'm offering you a choice, not an order. You can't be serious, Callahan sputtered. This woman is facing substantial... I'm very serious, Your Honor. Riker's eyes never left Clara's face. The money's real. Count it if you want. But the lady gets to decide, not you, not them. He jerked his head toward Driscoll and Brennan without looking at them. Her. Clara's thoughts were a stampede. This was crazy. This man could be anyone, a criminal, a killer, someone worse than the devils she already knew. But something in her gut, some instinct she'd learned to ignore after years of being told she was stupid and worthless and too emotional to think clearly, was screaming at her to trust this. To trust him. If I say yes, she said slowly, what happens after? What do you want from me? Riker considered the question like it mattered. Honestly, I haven't thought that far ahead. But I figure we can work it out as we go. I'm not asking you to love me, Mrs. Holloway. I'm asking if you'd rather take your chances with a stranger who's offering you freedom, or with men who've already shown you exactly who they are. He wasn't wrong. Clara looked at Driscoll, at Brennan, at the gallery full of men who'd laughed at her humiliation. Then she looked back at Riker Vale, at his scarred face, and his strange calm, and his inexplicable offer. 53 minutes, Mrs. Holloway, Callahan said tightly. She took a breath that felt like it might be her last as the woman she'd been. I accept, she said. I'll marry him. The courthouse erupted again, but this time Clara didn't hear it. She was watching Riker's face, looking for the trap, the trick, the moment when he'd reveal what he really wanted. But all she saw was a slight nod, almost respectful. And then he turned to Callahan. Get the paperwork ready, Your Honor, and count that money carefully. I want a receipt. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took 11 minutes. Callahan tried to stall, demanded identification Riker didn't have, questioned the money's provenance, suggested they wait for a proper minister. But Riker just stood there, patient and immovable as a stone, until Callahan ran out of objections and admitted that territorial law allowed him to perform marriages in his capacity as circuit judge. They stood in front of the bench. Riker smelled like leather, gun oil, and wood smoke. Clara kept her hands clasped in front of her, focusing on breathing steadily, refusing to shake even though everything in her wanted to run. Do you, Clara Elizabeth Holloway, take this man? Callahan couldn't quite hide his distaste. Riker Vale, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part. Clara's mouth was dry as desert sand. I do. And do you, Riker Vale, take this woman, Clara Elizabeth Holloway, to be your lawfully wedded wife, under the same terms and conditions? I do, Riker said. His voice was steady. Then by the power vested in me by the Nebraska Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. God help you both. Callahan banged his gavel like he was hammering a nail into a coffin. Mrs. Vale, you're free to go. Mr. Vale, the deed will be transferred to your wife's name within 3 business days, provided the bank confirms these funds are legitimate. They are, Riker said. Clara felt dizzy. Mrs. Vale. She was Mrs. Vale now, married to a stranger with 2 guns and a face like a wanted poster. What had she done? Riker touched her elbow, barely, just enough to guide her toward the door. His hand was warm through her sleeve. We should leave, he said quietly. She nodded, numb, and let him lead her down the aisle. The men in the gallery watched them go in hostile silence. Driscoll looked like he wanted to spit. Brennan's eyes were cold with something Clara recognized as wounded pride. Outside, the afternoon sun was brutal and bright after the courthouse dimness. Clara's wagon was still hitched across the street, ancient, weathered, pulled by a horse too old to be reliable but too stubborn to die. She'd driven it into town this morning thinking she might drive it home tonight for the last time. Now she didn't know what she was doing. That yours? Riker nodded at the wagon. Yes, was. I don't know anymore. It's still yours. Everything's still yours. He glanced up at the sky where dark clouds were building in the west. Storm coming. We should get moving. Where? Your farm, I assume, unless you've got somewhere else to be. Clara almost laughed. It came out bitter. The farm. Right, the farm I just married a stranger to keep. Riker looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his expression she couldn't quite read. You want to stay here instead? Go back in there and ask Callahan to annul it? She shook her head quickly. No, She pressed her hands to her face, trying to organize thoughts that felt like scattered chickens. This is insane, you know that, right? This whole thing is completely insane. Yeah, Riker agreed. It is. Then why did you do it? He was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the distance. The storm, or maybe something beyond it. Let's just say I had my reasons. We can talk about it later, once we're somewhere safer than the middle of town. Something in his tone made Clara's skin prickle. Safer? What do you mean, safer? But Riker was already moving toward the wagon, checking the horse's harness with efficient, practiced movements. You drive, or should I? I'll drive. It's my wagon. The words came out sharper than she'd meant them, but she needed something familiar right now, something she controlled. Riker nodded and climbed up beside her. Clara took the reins, clucked to the horse, and they rolled forward down Harlan's dusty main street. People stared from windows and doorways. News traveled fast in small towns, and she'd just given them enough gossip to last a month. Let them talk. The road north towards her farm cut through empty grassland, dry and yellow from weeks without rain. The clouds Riker had noticed were building faster now, turning the western sky the color of bruises. Wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain. They rode in silence for a while. Clara's mind was spinning. She kept glancing sideways at the man beside her, her husband now, legally, impossibly, trying to figure out what she'd gotten herself into. You always carry 2 guns? She asked finally. Usually. You a gunfighter? Sometimes. Outlaw? He smiled, just barely. Not currently. That's not a no. No, ma'am, it's not. Clara tightened her grip on the reins. So what are you exactly? And don't tell me you just wander around paying off strangers' debts out of the kindness of your heart. I don't have much kindness left, Riker said, still looking ahead. But I've got debts of my own to settle. Different kind. What's that supposed to mean? He turned to look at her then, and Clara saw something hard and old in his eyes. It means your husband was into some things he shouldn't have been. It means the men he crossed don't forgive and don't forget. And it means you were about 24 hours away from dying in your sleep when I showed up. Clara's blood went cold. What? I'll explain everything once we get to the farm. Right now I need you to trust me, and the gunshot cracked through the air like lightning. The horse screamed and reared. Clara hauled back on the reins, fighting to control the panicked animal, her heart slamming against her ribs. Riker was already moving, one gun out, his head snapping around to track the shot. Down! He barked. Clara threw herself flat across the wagon seat, just as 3 more shots punched through the air. Wood splintered beside her head. She heard Riker return fire, the sound deafening, and then men were shouting, and the horse was bolting, and everything became chaos and thunder. The wagon careened wildly. Clara clung to the seat, splinters digging into her palms, rain suddenly hammering down in cold sheets that turned the road to mud. She couldn't see anything, just rain and darkness, and flashes of lightning that lit up shapes moving in the grass. Riders. At least 4 of them. Riker fired again, and one of the shapes fell. But the others kept coming, closing in on both sides, their guns spitting fire through the storm. Clara heard bullets tearing into the wagon bed, felt the whole vehicle shudder as a wheel hit something and nearly tipped them over. Clara! Riker's voice cut through the chaos. Can you drive in this? I don't know. Try. He shoved the reins into her hands and twisted around, firing with both guns now, the muzzle flashes bright as magnesium in the darkness. Clara grabbed the reins with shaking hands and screamed at the horse to run. Just run. Anywhere away from the bullets and the rain and the men trying to kill them. The wagon jolted violently. Clara bit her tongue hard enough to taste blood. Beside her, Riker ejected spent shells and reloaded with mechanical precision, his hands steady even as the wagon bucked and swayed beneath them. Who are they? Clara shouted over the storm. People who want you dead. Why? Because your husband stole something valuable and they think you know where it is. Another shot. This one hit the horse. The animal went down screaming, tangling in the harness, and suddenly they were tumbling, the wagon tipping sideways, the world spinning in a confusion of mud and rain and breaking wood. Clara hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. For a second she just lay there, stunned, tasting mud and blood, her body screaming that something was broken even though she couldn't tell what. Rain pounded down on her. Lightning showed her the overturned wagon, the dying horse, Riker on his feet somehow, firing at shapes in the darkness. "Get up!" he roared. "Clara, get up!" She tried. Her body didn't want to cooperate. Everything hurt. Riker's hand closed around her arm, hauling her upright with strength that shocked her. "Run," he said, and shoved her toward a line of trees she could barely see through the rain. "Run and don't stop." "What about you?" "I'll handle this. Go." But Clara didn't run. She stood there, frozen, watching Riker face down 4 armed men in the middle of a thunderstorm like it was something he did every Tuesday. He moved like violence made flesh, ducking, rolling, firing with terrible accuracy. One rider fell, then another. The remaining 2 charged straight at him. Clara didn't think. She grabbed a piece of broken wood from the wagon and swung it with everything she had as the first rider passed. It caught him across the chest, and he toppled backward off his horse, hitting the mud with a wet thud. The last rider wheeled his mount around, gun raised, pointed directly at Clara's chest. Riker's shot took him in the throat before he could pull the trigger. Then silence. Just the rain and the thunder and Clara's ragged breathing. Riker walked over to each fallen man, checking them with quick efficiency. 3 dead. 1 unconscious, the one Clara had hit. He zip-tied the man's wrists with something from his coat, then came back to Clara. "You all right?" His voice was rough, breathless. Clara looked down at herself. Her dress was ruined, soaked with mud and rain, and probably blood. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold them still. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't think so." "Anywhere actively bleeding?" She checked, running her hands over her arms, her ribs. Everything hurt, but nothing felt wet with blood. "No, I don't think so." "Good." Riker caught one of the riderless horses, a big bay mare still wearing her saddle. "We need to move. There might be more." "More?" Claire's voice came out high and thin. "How many people are trying to kill me?" "I don't know yet, but we're not staying here to count them." He boosted her up onto the horse with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. Clara had never ridden like this, pressed against a man's chest while he controlled the reins, but she didn't have the strength to argue. They rode hard through the storm, leaving the wreckage behind. Clara's farm was 4 miles north, but Riker bypassed it entirely, heading east into rougher country where the grass gave way to rocky hills and scattered pine. She wanted to ask where they were going, but couldn't make her voice work. Shock was setting in, turning her arms and legs heavy and strange. Finally, as the storm began to ease, Riker guided the horse into a narrow canyon and dismounted near a rock overhang that offered some shelter. He lifted Clara down like she weighed nothing and helped her into the dry space beneath the overhang. "We'll rest here tonight," he said. "They won't track us in this weather." Clara sat with her back against cold stone, watching Riker unsaddle the horse and check their supplies, which consisted of the saddlebags that had been on the horse and whatever he carried in his coat. Not much. Enough to survive, maybe. For a while. Her teeth started chattering. Riker noticed. He came over, shrugged out of his coat, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled like him, leather and smoke and rain. "You want to tell me what the hell is going on?" Clara's voice shook, but she got the words out. Riker sat down across from her, water dripping from his hair. In the dim light, his scars looked deeper, older. "Your husband was working as an informant." "What?" Thomas Holloway was gathering evidence against a criminal organization that runs half the commerce through this territory. Smuggling, protection, land fraud, you name it. He was supposed to hand everything over to federal marshals 3 weeks ago. Riker paused. Instead, he died. Clara's stomach twisted. "You think they killed him?" "I know they did. His wagon accident wasn't an accident." "How do you know?" "Because I was supposed to be his contact. I'm the marshal he was supposed to meet." Clara stared at him. "You're a federal marshal?" "More or less. I work independently, mostly tracking organizations like this one. Thomas had been feeding me information for months. Then suddenly he went quiet, and a week later I heard he was dead." Riker's jaw tightened. "I came to Harlan to find out what happened. Found out his widow was about to be forced into marriage to settle debts that shouldn't exist." "The debt was fake?" "The debt was leverage. They wanted to control you, keep you close, make sure you didn't know anything and couldn't tell anyone if you did." He looked at her steadily. When I heard what was happening in that courthouse, I figured the best way to protect you was to marry you myself before someone else did. Someone who'd kill you quietly once they were sure you didn't have what they needed. Clara's mind was reeling. What do they think I have? A map. Coded records. Thomas told me he'd hidden evidence somewhere safe, but he never said where. These people think you know. I don't know anything. Thomas never told me anything. I believe you. But they don't, and they'll tear you apart trying to find out anyway. Riker's voice was flat, matter of fact. That's why we can't go back to your farm. That's why we're here. We need to figure out what Thomas hid and where he hid it before they do. Clara pulled his coat tighter around herself. She was married to a federal marshal. Her husband had been murdered. Men were trying to kill her for information she didn't have. 3 weeks ago, her biggest problem was whether the chickens would lay enough eggs to sell at market. This is insane, she whispered. Yeah, Riker agreed. It is. They sat in silence while the storm slowly died and night fell completely. Somewhere out in the darkness, the men who wanted Clara dead were regrouping, planning, hunting, and she was hiding in a canyon with a stranger who'd become her husband to save her life. Clara looked at Riker across the small space. His face was shadowed, unreadable, but there was something solid about him, something that made her think maybe, just maybe, she'd made the right choice in that courthouse. Thank you, she said quietly, for what you did. For everything. Riker met her eyes. Don't thank me yet. We're a long way from safe. Still, you could have let them have me. No, he said simply. I couldn't. Something in the way he said it made Clara's chest tighten. She pulled the coat closer and leaned her head back against the stone. Exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. Her body ached. Her mind couldn't hold another thought. Get some sleep, Riker said. I'll keep watch. Clara wanted to argue, to say she should take a turn, but her eyes were already closing. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Riker sitting at the edge of their shelter, silhouetted against the night, both guns in his lap. Watching, waiting, keeping her alive. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a horse snorting somewhere nearby. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in her farmhouse, that Thomas was already up doing chores, that the past 24 hours had been nothing but a fever dream brought on by bad meat. Then she opened her eyes and saw rock overhead instead of wooden rafters, felt the ache in every muscle, remembered the wagon flipping and the gunshots and Riker's hands pulling her to safety. Not a dream. Real. All of it horrifyingly real. She sat up too fast and her head spun. Riker was crouched by a small fire he'd built near the canyon mouth, far enough back that the smoke wouldn't be visible from a distance. He'd somehow produced a battered tin pot and was pouring dark liquid into 2 metal cups. How long did I sleep? Clara's voice came out rough. 6 hours, give or take. Sun's been up about an hour. He brought her one of the cups. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot and Clara wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully. How do you feel? Like I got thrown from a wagon and spent the night on rocks. She took a sip, winced at the bitterness. You sleep at all? Some, which probably meant no. Clara studied him in the morning light. He looked tired but alert, his coat back on, both guns still in place. The unconscious rider from last night was nowhere to be seen. What happened to the man I hit? She asked. Tied him to a tree about a mile west. He'll work himself loose eventually, assuming the coyotes don't find him first. Riker said it like he was discussing the weather. He didn't know much anyway. Just hired muscle working for whoever's running this operation now. Now? You mean it wasn't always the same people? Organizations like this, leadership changes. People get arrested, killed, decide to retire. Someone new steps up. Riker drank his coffee, staring out at the canyon opening. Your husband was tracking a man named Silas Hetch. Big player in the territory, ran smuggling operations from Omaha to the western settlements. Thomas gathered enough evidence to put Hetch away for 20 years. So where is this evidence now? That's what we need to figure out. Riker reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and water-stained. This was in your husband's last letter to me, sent 3 days before he died. He handed it to Clara. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded it. Thomas's handwriting, she recognized it immediately. cramped and precise, every letter carefully formed, but the words made no sense. The harvest waits in grandmother's garden where the stones remember 7 summers and the oak stands witness. Find the 3rd row from the eastern light and dig where roots run deep. Clara read it twice. What is this? Code, probably. Thomas knew his letters might be intercepted. He wouldn't write anything direct. Riker leaned forward. Does any of it mean anything to you? Grandmother's garden, stones, oak trees. She wanted to help, wanted desperately to decode whatever Thomas had left behind, but her mind was blank. I don't know. We didn't have grandmothers nearby. Both his parents were dead before I met him, and mine passed when I was young. We never talked about gardens or stones or... She stopped. Wait, 7 summers. We were married 7 years this past June. Riker's eyes sharpened. What else happened 7 years ago? We bought the farm, moved out from Omaha where Thomas was working as a clerk. Clara's mind was racing now, pulling up memories she'd buried under the weight of the past few weeks. He said he wanted to start over, get away from the city. I thought he just wanted to farm. He was probably already informing by then, needed distance from people who might recognize him. Riker took the letter back, studying it. Your farm. Any oak trees there? 1. Big one on the east side of the property, near the old well. And stones? Clara felt something click into place. There's a rock garden. I always thought it was strange. Thomas insisted on building it right after we moved in, spent weeks arranging stones in rows. I asked him why, and he said it was for drainage, but we never had drainage problems there. Riker was already moving, dumping out his coffee and kicking dirt over the fire. That's it. That's where he hid everything. We can't go back to the farm, Clara said, standing up despite her protesting muscles. You said it yourself. They'll be watching. They will. But we don't have a choice. He was saddling the horse with quick, efficient movements. Whatever Thomas hid, it's the only leverage we have. Without it, you're just a loose end they need to clean up. With it, we've got something to trade. Trade to who? Federal marshals I trust. They can use the evidence to bring down Hetch's organization and put you in protective custody. He turned to face her, but we have to get to it first, and that means going back. Clara's stomach knotted, the thought of returning to the farm, to the place where Thomas had died, where armed men were probably waiting, made her want to run in the opposite direction. But Riker was right. Running wouldn't save her. The only way out was through. When? She asked. Tonight. We'll approach after dark, get what we need, and disappear before anyone knows we were there. He offered his hand to help her mount. Until then, we stay hidden and we stay quiet. They spent the day moving deeper into the canyon system, following dry creek beds and rocky paths that showed no tracks. Riker seemed to know exactly where he was going, like he'd memorized maps Clara couldn't see. They stopped twice, once at a spring where they refilled their canteens, once in a small cave where Riker made her eat jerky that tasted like leather but filled her empty stomach. Clara used the time to think. About Thomas and his secrets. About the 7 years she'd spent with a man she'd apparently never known at all. Had any of it been real? Had he ever actually loved her, or had she just been convenient cover for his other life? You're thinking too loud. Riker's voice cut through her spiral. They were sitting in the cave entrance, watching afternoon shadows stretch across the canyon floor. Clara had been staring at nothing, lost in her thoughts. Did you know Thomas well? She asked. Before he died, I mean. Riker considered the question. Well enough to trust his information, not well enough to call him a friend. What was he like when you met with him? Careful, methodical, scared, toward the end. Riker glanced at her. Why? I'm trying to figure out if I ever actually knew my husband. The words came out bitter. 7 years we lived together. 7 years I thought we were building something, and it turns out he was living a completely different life I knew nothing about. Maybe he was protecting you. Or maybe he just didn't trust me. Clara pulled her knees to her chest. Either way, I was just another part of his cover story, the simple farm wife who didn't ask questions. Riker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, For what it's worth, the few times Thomas mentioned you, he seemed genuine, like he actually cared. Seemed, Clara repeated, but you don't know. No, I don't know. At least he was honest. Clara appreciated that more than false comfort would have meant. She watched a hawk circle overhead, riding thermals in the hot afternoon air. What about you? She asked. You got family somewhere? Someone wondering where you are? No? No family at all? Not anymore. Something in his voice made it clear the subject was closed. They lapsed into silence. Clara dozed fitfully as the day wore on, her body demanding rest, even though her mind wouldn't settle. When she woke again, the sun was setting, and Riker was checking his guns with mechanical precision. Time to go, he said. The ride back to Clara's farm took 3 hours in the dark. They moved slowly, carefully, staying off the main road and cutting through fields where the grass was tall enough to hide their silhouettes. The closer they got, the tighter Clara's chest became. She kept expecting gunfire, kept waiting for riders to appear out of the darkness with guns blazing. But the night stayed quiet, except for crickets and the soft sound of their horses' hooves on dirt. Riker stopped about a quarter-mile from the farmhouse, in a grove of cottonwoods Clara recognized as the western edge of her property. He dismounted and helped her down, his hand steady on her waist. "Wait here," he whispered. "I'm going to scout ahead." "No." Clara grabbed his arm before he could leave. "This is my farm. I'm coming with you." Clara, "I'm coming with you," she repeated, putting steel in her voice. "You said we're partners in this, so we do it together." She could see him weighing it, deciding if it was worth arguing. Finally, he nodded. "Stay behind me. Step where I step. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" "Understood." They moved through the darkness like ghosts. Riker had an uncanny ability to navigate without making sound. Clara tried to match his footsteps, but kept snapping twigs and rustling grass. Every noise made her wince. The farmhouse came into view through the trees. Dark. Silent. No smoke from the chimney, no lights in the windows. It looked abandoned, which made Clara's skin crawl. Her home shouldn't look abandoned. Riker held up a hand and they stopped. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, watching, listening. Then he pointed toward the barn and mouthed, "2 men!" Clara squinted but couldn't see anything. Either Riker had better eyes or better instincts. Probably both. He gestured for her to follow and they circled wide, avoiding the barn entirely, heading toward the east side of the property where the oak tree stood black against the starlit sky. The rock garden was there, Thomas's strange project, rows of stones he'd arranged so carefully 7 years ago. They reached the oak without incident. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she was sure someone would hear it. The rock garden looked exactly as she remembered. 7 rows of stones, each row about 10 feet long, all of them pointing east toward where the sun would rise. "Third row from the eastern light," Riker murmured, quoting Thomas's letter. He counted the rows, then pointed. "There, we dig there." "With what?" "We don't have shovels." Riker pulled a folding knife from his boot. "We improvise." They dropped to their knees and started digging. The ground was hard, baked by weeks of drought, and progress was agonizingly slow. Clara used her hands, scraping dirt away while Riker worked the knife blade like a primitive trowel. Her fingernails broke. Her palms blistered, but she kept digging. 10 minutes in, her fingers hit something solid that wasn't a rock. "Here," she breathed. They dug faster, uncovering what looked like an old ammunition box, metal and heavy, sealed with a rusted lock. Riker examined it in the darkness, then used his knife to pry the lock open. The metal groaned, but gave way. Inside were papers, dozens of them, folded and stacked carefully, along with what looked like ledgers and a small leather journal. Even in the dim light, Claire could see Thomas's handwriting covering the pages. Riker pulled out one of the ledgers and flipped through it quickly. His face went hard. "This is it. This is everything. Names, dates, shipment routes, payoffs. Your husband documented the entire operation. So we leave now, right? We take this to your marshals and—" The gunshot cracked through the night air. The bullet hit the oak tree inches from Clara's head, sending bark fragments flying. She threw herself flat on instinct, her heart exploding into panic. Riker was already moving, shoving the box at her while drawing both guns. "Run!" he shouted. "Get to the trees and don't stop!" But Clara couldn't run. Her legs wouldn't work. She watched in frozen horror as men emerged from the darkness on all sides. 6, 8, maybe more. They'd been waiting, watching, letting them dig up the evidence before closing the trap. "Drop your weapons, Vale," a voice called from near the barn. Cultured, educated, nothing like the rough-hired guns from yesterday. "You're outnumbered and surrounded. Make this easy." Riker didn't drop anything. He stood between Clara and the approaching men, both guns raised. "You want easy? Leave now and I won't kill all of you." Someone laughed. Brave words from a man with 2 bullets against 20. "I can make 2 bullets go a long way." The men kept advancing, forming a tightening circle. Clara clutched the ammunition box to her chest, her mind screaming at her to move, to do something, but terror had her pinned in place. Then rough hands grabbed her from behind. She hadn't seen the man approach from the other side of the tree. He yanked the box from her arms and twisted her wrist behind her back hard enough to make her gasp in pain. Clara tried to fight, throwing her weight backward, but he was too strong. "Got the woman!" he shouted. Riker spun, both guns tracking toward Clara's captor, but he didn't fire. Couldn't fire without risking hitting her. The cultured voice spoke again, closer now. A man stepped into the moonlight near the oak tree, tall, well-dressed in a suit that had no business being out here in the dirt. He had silver hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his eyes. "Mr. Vale, we meet at last." The man smiled. "I'm Marcus Webb. I believe you've been disrupting my business operations." "Hetch's operations, you mean," Riker said. His guns were still up, but Clara could see the calculation in his stance. He was looking for an opening that didn't exist. "Hetch is in prison, thanks to evidence gathered by the late Mr. Holloway and testimony from witnesses we couldn't quite silence in time. I've assumed leadership of the organization." Webb's eyes shifted to Clara. "And you must be the grieving widow. My condolences on your loss. Though I suspect you're learning your husband was not quite the man you thought." Clara's captor twisted her arm harder and she bit back a cry. Her wrist felt like it was going to snap. "Let her go," Riker said. His voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it more terrifying. "This is between you and me." "No, Mr. Vale. This is about completeness, about ensuring no loose ends remain from Hetch's spectacular failure." Webb nodded toward the ammunition box. "That evidence should have been destroyed months ago. Now it will be, along with anyone who's seen its contents. You kill us, other marshals will come. Let them come. They'll find 2 bodies and no evidence. Just another tragic story of frontier violence." Webb pulled out a pistol, casual as if he were checking his pocket watch. "You first, I think. Then the woman. Quick and clean." Riker's finger tightened on his triggers. Claire could see him preparing to go down fighting, to take as many with him as possible. Noble and stupid and completely futile. Then she remembered the knife. The folding knife Riker had used for digging. It was still on the ground where he dropped it, half buried in the dirt pile. Maybe 3 feet from where she knelt with a man's hand wrapped around her wrist. Clara didn't think. Thinking would have stopped her. She lunged sideways, breaking the man's grip through pure surprise, and grabbed the knife. Her fingers closed around it and she spun, slashing wildly. The blade caught her captor across the forearm and he screamed, stumbling backward. Everything exploded into chaos. Riker fired both guns and 2 men dropped instantly. Return fire lit up the night like lightning, bullets whining past Clara's head as she scrambled toward the tree. Someone tackled her from the side, driving her into the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. She still had the knife. She stabbed upward blindly and felt resistance, heard a man's grunt of pain. Gunfire was constant now, deafening, punctuated by shouts and screams. Clara crawled through the dirt, trying to reach cover, trying to breathe through the panic. Her hands found the ammunition box and she grabbed it, hugging it to her chest like a shield. Something heavy fell beside her. One of Webb's men, dead or dying, she couldn't tell. Clara choked back bile and kept moving. Then strong hands grabbed her shoulders and she almost screamed before she recognized Riker's voice. "Can you run?" "Yes." "Then run! Now!" He hauled her to her feet and they sprinted toward the tree line, bullets chasing them, men shouting behind them. Clara's lungs burned. Her legs felt like water. But she ran anyway, clutching the box, following Riker's shadow through the darkness. They crashed into the cottonwood grove and Riker whistled sharply. Their horse appeared from wherever he'd left it hidden, already saddled, ready to go. He practically threw Clara into the saddle, vaulted up behind her, and kicked the horse into a gallop. More gunshots. Clara heard something whine past her ear, felt the horse stumble slightly but keep running. They burst out of the grove and into open grassland, the horse stretching out beneath them, eating up ground with long, desperate strides. Behind them, men were mounting up, giving chase. Clara could hear hoofbeats getting louder. How many? She gasped. Too many. Riker's arm was tight around her waist, holding her steady while he controlled the reins with one hand. His other hand still held a gun. Hold on! He turned the horse sharply, cutting toward rougher terrain where the grass gave way to rocks and gullies. The horse took it at full speed, jumping obstacles Clara couldn't even see in the darkness. She clung to the saddle horn with one hand, the ammunition box with the other, praying they wouldn't fall. The hoofbeats behind them were getting closer. Riker fired backward without looking, 3 shots that made the pursuing horses veer and slow, but only for a moment. They kept coming. They crested a rise, and suddenly there was nothing but air in front of them, a dry creek bed, maybe 10 feet down, with steep sides and a rocky bottom. The horse tried to stop, but momentum carried them forward. Clara screamed as they went over the edge. The landing jarred every bone in her body. The horse somehow stayed upright, scrambling in loose dirt and stone. Riker kicked it forward and they galloped along the creek bed, walls of earth rising on both sides. The pursuers reached the edge above them. Clara heard shouting, heard horses being reined in, but the drop was too steep to follow directly. They'd have to find another way down, which gave Riker and Clara maybe 2 minutes head start. The creek bed twisted and turned, opening finally into a wider canyon Clara recognized, the same one where they'd sheltered the night before. Riker guided the horse into the narrow passage and dismounted fast. Get down, quietly. Clara slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling. Riker led the horse deeper into the canyon, into the cave where they'd rested earlier. He tied the animal in the back where it wouldn't be visible, then came back for Clara. Give me the box. She handed it over, her arms shaking from holding it so tight. Riker quickly removed the documents and journal, stuffing them inside his coat. Then he took the empty box, crawled to the cave mouth, and threw it as far as he could into the darkness outside. It clattered on rocks maybe 30 yards away. What are you doing? Clara whispered, making them think we kept running. He pulled her deeper into the cave, into shadows so thick she couldn't see her own hands. Now we stay absolutely quiet. Don't move. Don't breathe loud. They're going to come right past us. They pressed themselves against the cold rock wall and waited. Claire's heart was beating so hard she was sure it would give them away. Blood rushed in her ears. Every breath sounded like a scream. Then she heard hoofbeats echoing through the canyon, men's voices calling to each other. They came through here. I can see fresh tracks. Spread out. Check every crevice. Light appeared, torches moving along the canyon floor like malevolent fireflies. Clara held her breath as one of Webb's men rode directly past their cave entrance, so close she could have reached out and touched his stirrup. Found something, another voice excited. Metal box, empty. They dumped it. Keep looking. They're on foot now, can't have gone far. More hoofbeats, more torches. Clara counted 6 men, then 8. They were everywhere, searching, calling to each other, their voices bouncing off the canyon walls in confusing echoes. One man dismounted right outside the cave. Clara could see his silhouette against the stars, could hear him breathing as he peered into the darkness where she and Riker hid. Please don't come closer. Please don't see us. The man took one step toward the cave entrance. Then someone shouted from farther up the canyon. Found tracks heading east. Fresh ones. The man outside hesitated, then turned and ran back to his horse. Within minutes, the searchers had moved on, following false tracks that might have been left by coyotes or might have been nothing at all. The sounds faded. The canyon fell silent again except for Clara's ragged breathing. They waited another hour before Riker finally moved. They'll be back when they realize the tracks don't lead anywhere. We need to leave before sunrise. And go where? Clara was so tired she could barely form words. They know this area. They'll find us. Not if we stop running. Riker checked his guns, reloading from ammunition he carried in his coat. We're going back to Harlan. Are you insane? That's the first place they'll look. Exactly, which is why they won't expect it. He looked at her in the darkness. Webb wants this evidence destroyed and you dead. But he's got a weakness. He needs to operate behind respectability, needs to maintain his cover as a legitimate businessman. He can't afford a public confrontation with federal marshals. So what do? We go public. We ride straight to the federal courthouse in Harlan, hand over everything Thomas collected, and force Webb to either back off or expose himself by attacking a federal building. Riker's voice was grim. It's risky, but it's the only play we've got left. Clara thought about it. Every option was terrible. But staying hidden meant eventually being found. Running meant living in fear forever. At least Riker's plan had an endgame. "Okay," she said. "We go to Harlan." They rested another hour, letting the horse recover, then rode out of the canyon in the pre-dawn darkness. The ride back to town took most of the day. They avoided roads, stuck to rough country, and stopped often to listen for pursuit. Clara dozed in the saddle, her body screaming for real sleep, real food, real safety. The sun was setting again when Harlan finally came into view. Wooden buildings and dusty streets that had witnessed Clara's forced marriage just 2 days ago. It felt like a lifetime. They approached from the east, staying hidden in a stand of trees until full darkness fell. Then Riker guided them down a back alley to the federal courthouse, a squat brick building that looked more like a warehouse than a seat of justice. A single light burned in an upstairs window. "Wait here," Riker said, dismounting. "No, we do this together, remember?" He looked like he wanted to argue, then nodded. They tied the horse and approached the courthouse door together. It was locked. Riker knocked. 3 sharp raps that echoed in the empty street. Nothing happened. He knocked again, harder. This time, footsteps sounded inside and the door cracked open. A man's face appeared in the gap, elderly, suspicious, wearing sleeping clothes and holding a rifle. "We're closed. Come back Monday." "Marshal Garrett?" Riker said. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "Riker Vale, federal contractor. I've got evidence on the Hetch organization and a witness who needs immediate protection." Garrett studied them for a long moment, then opened the door wider. "Get inside, quickly." They stepped into a dark hallway that smelled of old paper and gun oil. Garrett locked the door behind them and gestured toward the stairs. "Upstairs, my office." The office was small, cramped, dominated by a desk buried under reports and wanted posters. Garrett lit a second lamp and turned to face them properly. He was older than Clara had first thought, maybe 65, with white hair and tired eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. "Vale, I heard you were in the territory." His gaze shifted to Clara. "And you are?" "Clara Holloway?" "Clara Vale now." The name still felt strange. "My husband Thomas was gathering evidence against Silas Hetch before he was murdered." Garrett's expression changed. "Thomas Holloway. I heard about his death. Wagon accident, they said." "They lied," Riker said flatly. He pulled the documents from his coat and spread them on Garrett's desk. Thomas compiled a complete record of Hetch's entire operation. Names, routes, payoffs, everything. He died before he could hand it over. His widow was targeted to keep it buried. Garrett picked up one of the ledgers, scanning the entries. His face went pale. "Sweet merciful hell. Do you know what's in here?" "Some of it," Riker said. "Judges, businessmen, half the territorial government." Garrett flipped pages, his hands shaking slightly. "This could bring down the entire frontier smuggling network, but it'll also make powerful enemies." "We've already got enemies," Clara said. "Marcus Webb and 20 armed men who want us dead." Garrett looked up sharply. "Webb? Marcus Webb is involved in this. He's running the organization now that Hetch is in prison." Riker leaned against the desk. "He knows we have this evidence. He'll come for it. For us. Probably soon. Then we need to move fast." Garrett was already gathering the documents, sorting them with practiced efficiency. "I can have these photographed and copies sent to federal authorities in 3 states by tomorrow morning. Once it's distributed, there's no point killing you. The evidence will already be public." Clara felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. "So we'll be safe." Garrett hesitated. "Safer. But Webb's organization won't disappear overnight. They'll regroup, try to salvage what they can, and they'll want revenge." He looked at both of them seriously. "You'll need to leave the territory. Start over somewhere they can't easily find you." "I just lost my farm," Clara said quietly. "I've got nothing to start over with. The government can provide some compensation, witness protection funds. It won't be much, but it'll get you established somewhere else." Garrett turned to Riker. "And you? What are your plans?" Riker glanced at Clara, something unreadable in his expression. "Haven't thought that far ahead." They spent the next hour going through the evidence with Garrett, explaining what they knew, filling in details from Thomas's cryptic notes. Clara learned things about her late husband that made her stomach turn, the risks he'd taken, the lies he'd told, the dangerous men he'd confronted. Part of her wanted to hate him for dragging her into this. Another part couldn't help feeling proud that he'd tried to do something right, even if it had gotten him killed. Around midnight, Garrett sent them to a back room where they could rest while he worked on securing the evidence. It was barely more than a storage closet, with one narrow cot and a single window looking out onto the alley. Clara sat on the cot, suddenly aware of how filthy she was, covered in mud and blood and dried sweat, her dress torn, her hair falling out of its pins. She probably smelled terrible. She didn't care. Riker stood by the window, watching the street below with the vigilance that never seemed to leave him. "You should sleep," Clara said. "You've been awake for 2 days straight." "So have you." "I slept in the canyon. You kept watch." He didn't answer, just kept staring out the window. Clara studied him in the lamplight, the scars, the tired lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man who'd forgotten how to relax. "What happens after this?" she asked. "After Garrett distributes the evidence and Webb backs off?" "You start over somewhere. Oregon, maybe. California. Somewhere far from here." "And you?" Riker was quiet for a long moment. "I go back to work. There's always another organization to track, another set of bad men who need stopping." "Alone?" "That's how I work best." Clara felt something twist in her chest. They'd been married for 2 days, most of it spent running and fighting and surviving. But somewhere in the chaos, she'd started to think of them as a unit, as partners. The idea of Riker just walking away after this, disappearing back into whatever dangerous life he led, felt wrong. "We're married," she said. "Legally, I mean. That doesn't just go away. We can get it annulled. Tell a judge it was done under duress, which isn't exactly a lie." Riker still didn't turn around. "You'll be free to start fresh without being tied to someone like me." "Someone like you," Clara repeated. "You mean someone who saved my life? Someone who's risked everything to keep me safe? Someone who kills people for a living? Someone who stops bad people from hurting innocents?" She stood up, moved to stand beside him at the window. "There's a difference." Riker finally looked at her. "You don't know me, Clara. Not really. The things I've done, the places I've been, you don't want any part of that life." "Maybe not. But I do know that when everyone else was treating me like livestock, you looked at me like a person. I know you married me to protect me when you could have just walked away. I know you've kept me alive when most men would have left me behind as dead weight." She held his gaze. "That counts for something." "It doesn't change what I am." "No. But it shows me who you are." Clara reached out, hesitated, then took his hand. His fingers were rough, scarred, warm. "I'm not saying I love you, I barely know you, but I'm saying maybe we don't have to figure out the rest right now. Maybe we just see what happens when we're not running for our lives." Riker looked down at their joined hands like he wasn't sure what to do with the contact. Then slowly his fingers closed around hers. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll see what happens." They stood together at the window, watching the empty street, waiting for dawn and whatever came after. Dawn came with the sound of breaking glass. Clara jerked awake from where she'd finally dozed off, sitting against the wall, Riker's coat draped over her shoulders. He was already on his feet, gun drawn, positioned beside the window. Below in the street, men were dismounting from horses, their voices carrying up through the broken courthouse window. "Garrett!" someone shouted. "We know Vale's in there. Send him out with the woman and the documents, or we burn the whole building down." Clara's heart dropped into her stomach. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the coat before it could fall. "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter." Riker moved to the door, cracking it open to listen. Voices echoed from downstairs, Garrett arguing with someone, his tone angry but controlled. "We need to get you out of here." "What about the evidence?" "Garrett already sent copies out this morning by telegraph and courier. The originals are in his safe." Riker checked his ammunition, his movements mechanical and precise. "Your part in this is done. Now you just need to survive long enough for the law to catch up." The law. Like it was something reliable, something that would actually arrive in time to save them. Clara had learned in the past 3 days that the law was slow and distance made it slower. Webb's men were here now, armed and ready to kill. More shouting from downstairs. Then a gunshot, deafening in the enclosed space. Riker swore under his breath. Back window, now. He crossed to the room's single rear window and forced it open. It overlooked a narrow alley, maybe a 10-foot drop to the ground below. Not impossible, but Clara's body was already a map of bruises, and her dress wasn't exactly designed for climbing. "I'll go first, catch you," Riker said, already swinging his leg over the sill. "Wait, what about Marshal Garrett?" "Garrett knows how to handle himself. You're my priority." He dropped out the window with barely a sound, landing in a crouch in the alley below. "Come on!" Clara hiked up her skirts and climbed onto the window ledge, her hands shaking. Heights had never been her friend. She looked down at Riker's upturned face and thought about how many times in the past 3 days she'd had to trust this man with her life. She jumped. The fall lasted maybe 2 seconds, but felt like an hour. Then Riker's hands caught her waist, and they both went down in a controlled tumble that left Clara breathless but unbroken. He hauled her upright immediately. "Can you run?" Clara wanted to laugh, or cry, or both. "Do I have a choice?" They ran. Behind them, the courthouse erupted in gunfire, shots echoing off brick walls, men screaming orders, the sound of wood splintering as Webb's men forced their way inside. Clara didn't look back. She focused on keeping up with Riker as he led her through a maze of alleys and back streets she'd never known existed in Harlan. They emerged near the livery stable where their horse was still tied. Riker had her mounted and moving before the sounds of fighting at the courthouse had even died down. They rode hard out of town, heading west this time instead of east, toward open prairie that stretched endlessly under a sky just beginning to lighten. "Where are we going?" Clara gasped, clinging to the saddle. "Away. We'll figure out the rest later." They rode for hours, stopping only when the horse started stumbling from exhaustion. Riker found a creek bed with enough water to refill their canteens and let the animal drink. Clara slid from the saddle and promptly sat down in the dirt, her legs refusing to hold her anymore. "We can't keep running forever," she said. We won't have to. Once Garrett's evidence reaches the right people, warrants will be issued. Webb will have to go underground or flee the territory entirely." Riker crouched beside the creek, splashing water on his face. "But until then, distance is our best defense." "How far is far enough?" "Oregon, maybe California. Somewhere the organization doesn't have reach." He looked at her, water dripping from his hair. "There's a wagon train forming up in Independence, Missouri. Leaves in 2 weeks for the Oregon Trail. We could join it, disappear into the migration." Clara stared at him. "You want us to go west? Across the whole continent? I want you alive. Everything else is negotiable." The absurdity of it hit her all at once. 4 days ago, she'd been standing in a courtroom fighting to keep a farm she'd never really wanted, married to a man she'd never really known. Now she was being hunted by criminals, married to a federal marshal, and discussing crossing 2,000 miles of wilderness to start over in a place she'd only heard about in newspapers. She started laughing. Couldn't help it. The laughter came up from somewhere deep and slightly hysterical, fueled by exhaustion and fear and the sheer impossible magnitude of how much her life had changed. Riker watched her with concern. "Clara." "I'm fine," she managed between gasps. "I'm fine. This is insane. All of it. Completely insane." "Yeah," he agreed quietly. "It is." The laughter died as quickly as it had come, leaving Clara hollow and shaking. Riker came over and sat beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the solid reality of him. "I never wanted to leave Nebraska," she said. "I was born here. My parents are buried here. Thomas is buried here. It's the only home I've ever known." "I know, but there's nothing left for me here, is there? Even if Webb gets arrested, even if the organization collapses, I can't go back to that farm. Can't pretend any of this never happened." "No," Riker said. "You can't." Clara looked out at the empty prairie, at the grass bending in the wind, at the endless horizon that had always felt like a wall keeping her contained. Now it felt like a door opening onto something vast and unknown and terrifying. "Oregon," she said. "All right, we go to Oregon." They reached Independence 12 days later, having traded their exhausted horse for a wagon and team in Kansas City, using money Riker produced from sources Clara didn't ask about. The wagon was old but sturdy. The horses were mean-tempered but strong, and they arrived at the staging grounds just as the wagon train was finishing its preparations for departure. Independence was chaos. Hundreds of wagons crowded the assembly area, families loading supplies, children running wild, livestock adding their voices to the general pandemonium. Clara stood beside their wagon and stared at the sheer scale of it all, feeling very small and very lost. Mr. and Mrs. Vale? A man approached them, stocky, weathered, with a beard that looked like it had never met a razor. I'm Jacob Morrison, wagon master for this train. Heard you wanted to join up. That's right, Riker said. He'd adopted a different manner for this, less dangerous, more settled, playing the role of a farmer heading west with his wife. We've got supplies for the journey, good wagon, strong team. We can pull our weight. Morrison walked around their wagon, checking the wheels, the canvas cover, the boxes of supplies Riker had purchased. You done this before? No, sir, but we're fast learners. You'll need to be. Oregon trails 2,000 miles of hell, and that's on good days. Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt. What's your trade, Mr. Vale? Security. I've done guard work, some bounty hunting, can shoot if there's trouble. Morrison's expression shifted, calculating. We could use another man who knows his way around firearms. Had 3 families drop out last week, left us light on able-bodied men. He looked at Clara. Your wife able to handle herself? Trail's hard on women. Clara bristled, but Riker spoke before she could. She's tougher than she looks. She'll need to be. Morrison pulled out a ledger. $100 to join the train. That includes my services as guide and protection from the men riding scout. We leave day after tomorrow at first light. Miss the departure and you're on your own. Rules are posted at the main tent. Read them, follow them, or get left behind. Understood? Riker counted out the money. Understood. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Riker made Clara practice loading and firing a rifle until her shoulder ached from the recoil. She'd shot Thomas's old hunting rifle a few times on the farm, but never with any real purpose. Now Riker drilled her like a soldier, making her reload faster, aim better, shoot until the targets he set up were riddled with holes. I don't want to kill anyone, she said after the 10th round of practice. I know, but if someone tries to kill you, I want you able to defend yourself when I'm not there. He adjusted her stance, tapping her foot with his boot. Wider. Balance your weight. Clara wanted to argue that he was always there, that he never left her side, but she knew that wouldn't last forever. The trail was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Webb's organization. There would be river crossings, mountain passes, encounters with hostile forces that wouldn't care about her story or her fear. She fired again. The bottle Riker had set up on a fence post exploded into fragments. Better, he said. The wagon train departed on a gray morning with rain threatening from the north. 143 wagons rolled out of Independence in a line that stretched for over a mile, wheels creaking, animals complaining, children waving goodbye to everything they'd ever known. Clara sat on the wagon seat beside Riker, the reins in her hands because he insisted she learn to drive the team properly. The horses fought her at first, sensing her uncertainty, but she gritted her teeth and held firm. Behind them, everything familiar disappeared into distance and dust. The first week was misery. The trail was rougher than Clara had imagined, all rocks and ruts and river crossings that left everyone soaked and shivering. Her hands blistered from holding the reins. Her back ached from the constant jolting. At night she collapsed into their wagon bed, too exhausted to even eat the meager dinner Riker prepared over their campfire. This was your brilliant plan, she muttered one evening, trying to massage feeling back into her shoulders. Run away to Oregon. It'll be safer, you said. Riker stirred something in their cooking pot that smelled like boiled leather. I said it would get you away from Webb. Didn't say it would be comfortable. Comfortable? Right. Clara looked around at their campsite, one of hundreds spread across the prairie, fires dotting the darkness like fallen stars. Where did you learn to cook? Prison? Close. Army. She blinked. You were in the Army? For a while, before I got smart and left. He ladled the stew into 2 tin bowls and handed her one. Eat. You'll need your strength. The stew was terrible, but Clara ate it anyway, too hungry to care. Around them, other families were settling in for the night, parents calling children, livestock being tended, the low murmur of conversations in a dozen different languages. Clara caught fragments as people passed by. German families heading for farmland, Swedish loggers going to the timber country, a Chinese couple who kept to themselves but whose wagon bore intricate paintings Clara found beautiful. We're not the only ones running, she said quietly. No one takes this journey unless they're running from something or towards something better. Riker ate his stew without seeming to taste it. Sometimes both. A woman approached their fire, older, maybe 50, with steel gray hair and a face carved by hard years. Evening. I'm Margaret Chen. My husband and I are 3 wagons back. Clara stood, wiping her hands on her already filthy dress. Clara Vale. This is my husband Riker. Margaret's eyes were sharp, assessing. You two are new to the trail. That obvious? Your hands haven't toughened yet, and you're still trying to keep your dress clean. Margaret smiled, not unkindly. Give it 2 more weeks. You'll stop caring about the dirt. Looking forward to it, Clara said dryly. I organize the women for chores when we stop, gathering wood, fetching water, cooking for the sick. We help each other. You interested? Clara glanced at Riker, who nodded slightly. Yes, I'd like that. Good. We start at dawn before the wagons roll. Margaret turned to leave, then paused. Fair warning. Some of the women won't be friendly at first. You're young, pretty, despite the trail dirt, and you've got a husband who looks like he can actually protect you. That breeds jealousy. Don't let it get to you. After she left, Clara sat back down. Pretty? Has she looked at me recently? You're beautiful, Riker said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. You just don't see it. Clara felt her face heat. They'd been married almost 3 weeks, and he'd never said anything like that before. Probably because they'd been too busy running for their lives to think about things like attraction or compliments or what it meant that they were legally bound to each other. You don't have to say things like that, she muttered. I don't say things I don't mean. She looked at him across the fire, at his scarred face and serious eyes, and felt something shift in her chest, something warm and unsettling and more complicated than gratitude. We should sleep, she said, standing up quickly. Early start tomorrow. That night, lying in the wagon bed with Riker on the ground beneath keeping watch as he always did, Clara stared at the canvas above her head and wondered what she was doing, wondered if this marriage that had started as desperate survival could ever become something real, wondered if she even wanted it to. The trail got harder. 2 weeks in, they hit the first major river crossing, the Kansas River, swollen from spring melt and running fast enough to be dangerous. Clara watched in horror as the first wagon tried to ford and nearly tipped, water pouring in through gaps in the canvas, the family inside screaming as their possessions floated away. We're crossing that? She asked Morrison when he rode by their wagon. Unless you want to turn back. We go through, not around. He pointed downstream. We'll chain the wagons together, lighten the loads, and pull everyone across. You'll get wet. Try not to drown. Riker spent an hour waterproofing their supplies, wrapping everything essential in oilcloth and tying it down. Then they joined the line of wagons, inching toward the riverbank. The water hit like a wall of ice. Clara gasped as it poured over the side, soaking her skirts, filling her boots. The wagon rocked violently. The horses panicked, trying to rear despite the current pulling them forward. Riker was beside her instantly, taking the reins, his voice calm and steady as he talked the animals through their terror. Don't look down, he told Clara. Keep your eyes on the far bank. She tried, but the water was everywhere, rushing past with enough force to make the whole wagon shudder. Beside them, another wagon started to tip. Clara heard screaming, saw children clinging to their parents as the current dragged them downstream. Riker, I see them. Hold the reins. He shoved the leather straps into her hands and dove off the side of the wagon before Clara could stop him. She watched in frozen horror as he swam toward the capsizing wagon, fighting the current, reaching the children just as they lost their grip and started to go under. Clara held the reins with white-knuckled desperation, talking to the horses the way Riker had, praying they wouldn't bolt or stumble or do anything that would send her into that freezing water. The far bank was so close. 20 feet, 50... Riker surfaced with the child under each arm, swimming one-handed toward shore. Men on the bank were throwing ropes, shouting instructions Clara couldn't hear over the roar of water. She kept the horses moving forward, inch by terrible inch, until suddenly the wagon lurched up onto solid ground and she could breathe again. She set the brake with shaking hands and climbed down, her legs barely holding her. Other families were already gathering around the children Riker had saved, wrapping them in blankets, checking them for injuries. The parents were crying, thanking Riker over and over while he stood there dripping and uncomfortable, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Clara pushed through the crowd and grabbed his arm. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." "You could have drowned." "But I didn't." He was shivering, his lips slightly blue. "We should get the wagon set up. Long day tomorrow." That night, after Riker had changed into dry clothes and they'd shared another terrible meal by the fire, Clara couldn't stop replaying the image of him diving into that river without hesitation. "You didn't think twice," she said, "about jumping in to save those kids. No time to think, they needed help. Most men would have let someone else do it." Riker poked at the fire with a stick, not looking at her. "I'm not most men." "No," Clara agreed quietly. "You're not." The weeks blurred together after that. Clara fell into the rhythm of the trail, wake before dawn, help the other women with breakfast, drive the wagon until noon, stop for a brief rest, drive until evening, make camp, collapse. Her hands toughened. Her arms got stronger. Her dresses became so filthy she stopped caring, just like Margaret had predicted. She learned the names of the families around them. The Brenners, a German family with 6 children who all had the same white blonde hair. The Tanaka couple, who spoke limited English but whose daughter translated stories that made Clara laugh despite her exhaustion. The Morrison family themselves, including Jacob's wife Sarah, who was 8 months pregnant and still insisted on walking beside their wagon every day. Clara also learned to shoot properly. Not just targets, but moving ones, when Riker took her hunting for fresh meat to supplement their dwindling supplies. She got her first rabbit on the 3rd try, felt sick about it for an hour, then helped Riker skin and cook it because wasting the meat would be worse than the guilt. "You're doing good," he told her one evening, watching her clean the rifle with the same careful attention he'd taught her. "Better than I expected." "You expected me to collapse after a week, didn't you?" "Honestly?" "Yeah." Clara threw a rag at him. He caught it, almost smiling. They were more than 2 months into the journey when everything went to hell again. The attack came at dawn, just as the wagon train was preparing to roll out. Clara was helping Margaret collect firewood when she heard the first gunshots, sharp cracks that sent birds exploding from the nearby trees. She dropped the wood and ran back toward their wagon, her heart slamming into her throat. Riders. At least 20 of them circling the wagon train, firing into the air, driving the livestock into panic. But these weren't the random bandits Morrison had warned them about. Clara recognized the coordinated precision, the way they moved like a unit. Webb's men. They'd found her. "Clara!" Riker's voice cut through the chaos. He was running toward her, rifle in hand, his face set in the hard lines she recognized from their first meeting. "Get to the wagon, now!" She ran. Other families were scrambling for cover, children crying, men grabbing weapons. The riders were closing in, their shouts carrying over the screaming. "We want the woman, the one called Clara Vale. Give her up, and the rest of you live." Morrison rode past, firing at the attackers, his face furious. "Like hell! Everyone arm up! Protect the wagons!" The trail erupted into a firefight. Clara reached their wagon and grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Riker was beside her a second later, both his guns out, his eyes scanning for targets. "How many?" she gasped. "Too many. But Morrison's people are fighters." He fired twice and a rider fell. "Stay behind the wagon. Shoot anything that gets close." The battle was brutal and chaotic. Clara had never been in anything like this. Not even the ambush at her farm had prepared her for the scale of it. Bullets tore through canvas. Horses screamed. She saw a man go down clutching his leg, saw Margaret Chen firing a shotgun with methodical calm, saw children being shoved under wagons for protection. Clara aimed at a rider charging toward their position and pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her back, but the shot went wide. She reloaded, aimed again, fired. This time, the rider's horse stumbled and threw him. "Good," Riker shouted over the gunfire. "Keep on! Keep going!" She kept going. Reload, aim, fire, reload, aim, fire. Her world narrowed to those 3 actions, repeated until her shoulder ached and her ears rang and smoke burned her eyes. Then she saw him. Marcus Webb himself riding a black horse, directing his men with hand signals, his face cold and composed despite the battle raging around him. He was looking for her, scanning the wagons, searching. Their eyes met across the chaos. Webb smiled and drew his pistol. Clara's blood turned to ice. She raised her rifle, but her hands were shaking too hard to aim properly. Webb was kicking his horse toward her, gun raised, close enough now that she could see the cruelty in his expression. Riker stepped between them. He fired both guns simultaneously, and Webb's horse went down, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. Webb rolled, came up shooting, but Riker was already moving, using the wagon for cover, returning fire with mechanical precision. Clara reloaded and aimed at Webb, waiting for a clear shot. But the fighting was too close, too confused. She couldn't risk hitting Riker or one of the other defenders. Morrison's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Fall back to the center! Circle formation!" The wagons began moving, families driving their teams into a defensive circle while men on foot provided covering fire. Clara stayed with Riker, shooting when she could, reloading frantically between shots. Webb's men were falling back, their assault broken by the organized defense. But Webb himself wasn't retreating. He was still on foot, still firing, still trying to reach Clara through the chaos. "You can't run forever," he screamed. "Those documents mean nothing. The organization is bigger than you know, bigger than any of you." Riker's response was 3 more shots that forced Webb to dive behind a dead horse. The battle ended abruptly. Webb's remaining men grabbed their wounded and retreated, riding hard toward the tree line. Morrison ordered his people to hold fire, to let them go rather than waste ammunition on fleeing targets. Clara lowered her rifle, her arms shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Around her, the wagon train looked like a war zone. 3 wagons were burning. Bodies lay in the grass, some from Webb's men, some from the train. She could hear crying, could smell blood and gunpowder and smoke. Riker appeared beside her, checking her over with quick efficiency. "You hurt?" "No, you." "I'm fine." But there was blood on his sleeve, a graze from a bullet that had come too close. He saw her looking and shrugged. "I've had worse." Morrison rode up, his face grim. "That man knew your wife by name. You want to explain what the hell that was about?" Riker met his eyes steadily. "My wife's first husband was an informant against a criminal organization. They want her dead to prevent her from testifying. And you brought them to my wagon train." "I didn't bring them. They followed. But I'll deal with them." "Like hell you will." Morrison's voice was hard. "You'll both leave. Now. Before they come back with reinforcements and finish what they started." Clara felt like she'd been punched. "You're throwing us out?" "I'm protecting 140 families who didn't sign up to be targets in your war." Morrison looked almost sorry. "I've got women and children here. I can't risk them for you two." "Those families just fought for us," Clara said, anger rising through her shock. "Margaret Chen and the Brenners and the Tanakas, they didn't run. They stood their ground. And 3 of them are dead because of it." Morrison's jaw was tight. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vale, but you've got 1 hour to pack your wagon and leave. That's all I can give you." He rode away before Clara could argue further. She stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes watching her. Some sympathetic, some angry, all of them afraid. "Come on," Riker said quietly. "We need to move." They packed in silence, loading their supplies back into the wagon, while other families watched from a distance. Margaret approached as they were finishing, her face sad. "I'm sorry," she said. "If it was up to me—" "It's all right," Clara interrupted, though it wasn't. "You have to protect your family. I understand." "Where will you go?" "West. We'll find another way to Oregon." Clara tied down the last of their supplies, her movements mechanical. "Take care of yourself, Margaret." They rolled out an hour later, leaving the wagon train behind. Clara didn't look back, couldn't bear to see the community she'd started to belong to disappearing into the distance. They traveled alone for 3 days, following the trail markers but staying well ahead of the main wagon train. Riker pushed them hard, stopping only when the horses absolutely needed rest. He was different now, quieter, more withdrawn, the easy partnership they'd been building replaced by something grimmer. On the 4th day, Clara finally had enough. "Talk to me," she said as they made camp in a rocky canyon. "About what?" "About whatever's making you act like I'm suddenly made of glass." Riker didn't look up from the fire he was building. "I'm just trying to keep you alive." "You've always tried to keep me alive. This is different." Clara moved to sit across from him. "You're angry." "I'm not—" He stopped, jaw tight. "Yeah, I'm angry." "At Morrison?" "At myself." He finally looked at her, and Clara saw something raw in his expression. I keep telling myself I'm protecting you, but all I'm doing is dragging you deeper into danger. First your farm, then Harlan, now the wagon train. People keep dying because of me. Because of Webb, Clara corrected. Because of the organization, not because of you. I should have left you in that courthouse. Let you marry Driscoll or Brennan. At least then you'd be alive and settled instead of running across the frontier with a target on your back. I'd be miserable and probably dead anyway once Webb's men came looking. Clara reached across and grabbed his hand, forcing him to meet her eyes. You gave me a choice, Riker. The first real choice I'd had in years. Don't regret that now. Even if that choice gets you killed. Even then. She squeezed his fingers. I'd rather die free than live as property. They sat in silence while the fire crackled between them. Finally, Riker said, We can't outrun them. Webb won't stop until you're dead, or he is. So what do? We find somewhere to make a stand, somewhere defensible where we can force a final confrontation. His voice was flat, tactical. We end this. Clara's stomach twisted, but she nodded. She was tired of running, tired of fear. If Webb wanted her dead, then let him come and try. At least then it would be over, one way or another. They traveled for another week, moving through increasingly rough territory as they climbed toward the mountain passes. Other migrants passed them going the opposite direction, families who'd given up on Oregon and were heading back east, their wagons empty, their faces hollow. Turn back, one man warned them. Nothing but death in those mountains. Snow came early. Passes are already closing. But they kept going. Not because they had hope of making it through, but because stopping meant letting Webb catch them in the open. They found their battleground in a narrow canyon with high walls and only two entrances. One they came through, one that led deeper into the mountains. Riker spent 2 days fortifying their position, creating barriers from rocks and fallen trees, setting up supply caches, turning the canyon into a killing ground. When Webb comes, he told Clara, he'll come with everything he has. This is where we make our stand. Clara checked her rifle for the 100th time. And if we lose? We won't. But if we do? Riker looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to where she sat and pulled her to her feet. His hands cupped her face, calloused and warm, and before Clara could ask what he was doing, he kissed her. It was their first kiss. 3 months married, and this was the first time their lips had touched. It was gentle and fierce at the same time, tasting of dust and desperation, and something Clara couldn't quite name. When he pulled back, his eyes were serious. If we lose, at least we lose together. Clara's throat was tight. That's supposed to be comforting? It's the truth. The attack came at sunset on the 3rd day. Clara saw the dust cloud first, then heard the thunder of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Webb had brought an army, at least 30 riders, all armed, all ready to finish this. They rode into the canyon like they owned it, confident and casual, not expecting resistance. That was their first mistake. Riker opened fire from the high ground, and 3 men fell before the rest even knew they were under attack. Clara fired from her position behind a rock barrier, her shots more measured now, more controlled. She'd learned to kill, hated it, but did it anyway because the alternative was dying. The canyon became a hellscape of gunfire and screaming. Webb's men couldn't maneuver in the narrow space, couldn't use their numbers effectively. They were trapped, exposed, taking fire from positions they couldn't see. But there were so many of them, and Riker and Clara were just 2 people with limited ammunition. Fall back, Riker shouted. To the 2nd position. Shot. They retreated deeper into the canyon to the barriers Riker had built near the rear entrance. Webb's men followed, pressing their advantage, firing constantly. Clara felt a bullet whine past her ear, felt another tear through her skirt. She kept moving, kept shooting, her hand steady even though her heart was trying to beat out of her chest. Then Riker went down. Clara saw him stumble, saw blood bloom on his shoulder, saw him fall behind cover. She screamed his name and ran toward him, bullets kicking up dirt around her feet. She reached him and dragged him behind the barrier, her hands shaking as she checked the wound. Through and through, high on the shoulder, bleeding badly, but not immediately fatal. I'm okay, he gasped. Keep firing. You're shot. I've been shot before. Keep firing. Clara grabbed her rifle with bloody hands and took up position beside him. She fired until the barrel was hot, until her ammunition ran low, until her arms felt like they would fall off. And then, impossibly, she heard it. Bugles. Distant but clear. Webb's men heard it too. Their fire slackened as they turned to look back toward the canyon entrance. The bugles got louder, joined by the sound of many horses moving fast. Federal cavalry poured into the canyon like an avenging flood. Blue uniforms, military precision, overwhelming force. Clara watched in stunned disbelief as Webb's men threw down their weapons and raised their hands as soldiers surrounded them, as the battle that had seemed endless suddenly ended. An officer dismounted and approached their position, stepping carefully over bodies and debris. "Mr. and Mrs. Vale? I'm Captain Henderson, 5th Cavalry. Marshal Garrett sent us to find you." Clara just stared at him, unable to process that they were actually saved. Riker managed a weak laugh. "Took you long enough. We've been tracking you for 2 weeks. The wagon train gave us your general direction." Henderson looked around at the carnage, his expression grim. "Is Marcus Webb among the survivors?" "Over there." Riker pointed toward a man sitting against the canyon wall, hands zip-tied, face bloody. "That's him." Henderson detailed soldiers to secure Webb and round up the rest of the prisoners. Then he turned back to Riker and Clara. "You two need medical attention, and then you need to come with us. There's a federal courtroom waiting in Denver with your names on the witness list." Clara helped Riker to his feet, his good arm around her shoulders, her arm around his waist. They limped out of that canyon together, past the soldiers and prisoners and dead, into the fading light of evening. It was over. Finally, impossibly, it was over. The Denver courthouse smelled like whiskey and wood polish, a strange combination that made Clara's stomach turn as she sat in the witness box for the 3rd day in a row. Her hands were folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Her new dress, purchased by the federal government because everything she owned had been destroyed on the trail, felt stiff and foreign against her skin. Marcus Webb sat at the defendant's table in a fine suit that made him look like a respected businessman instead of the man who'd tried to kill her half a dozen times. His lawyer was talking, something about inadmissible evidence and unlawful search, but Clara had stopped listening an hour ago. She was focused on Webb's face, on the cold calculation in his eyes as he stared at her. He wasn't afraid. That's what bothered her most. Sitting there facing federal charges with enough evidence to hang him twice over, and he still looked like a man who believed he'd walk free. "Mrs. Vale," the prosecutor's voice pulled her back. "Can you identify the man who orchestrated the attack on the wagon train that resulted in 3 deaths? Clara pointed at Webb without hesitation. "That's him, Marcus Webb. And you're certain? I saw him directing his men. Heard him call for me by name. He wanted me dead because my husband gathered evidence against his organization." Webb's lawyer stood. "Objection. The witness is speculating about my client's motivations." "Sustained," Judge Hartwell said, sounding bored. "Mrs. Vale, please stick to what you personally witnessed." Clara gritted her teeth. This was the problem. The trial had been going on for 2 weeks, and every piece of testimony got picked apart by Webb's expensive lawyers until it sounded like nothing. The documents Thomas had gathered were damning, sure, but the defense kept arguing they'd been obtained illegally, that the chain of custody was broken, that a dead man's records couldn't be trusted. The courtroom was packed with reporters from newspapers across 3 states. Clara's story had spread, the widow forced into marriage who'd uncovered a criminal empire. They'd turned her into something she wasn't, some kind of frontier hero, when really she'd just been trying not to die. Riker sat in the gallery, his arm still in a sling from the shoulder wound that was healing slower than either of them liked. He caught her eye and nodded slightly. Steady, calm. She drew strength from that and turned back to the prosecutor. The questioning went on for another hour before Judge Hartwell finally called for a recess. Clara stepped down from the witness box on legs that felt like water, pushing through the crowd of reporters shouting questions she didn't answer. Riker met her outside in the hallway, his good hand finding hers. "You did fine." "He's going to walk." Clara's voice was flat. "You see how his lawyers are tearing everything apart? By the time they're done, the jury won't know what to believe. The evidence is solid." "Evidence doesn't matter if the jury thinks it was obtained through illegal means." She leaned against the wall, exhausted. "We should have just killed him in that canyon. Would have been cleaner. And you'd be the one on trial for murder." Riker squeezed her hand. "Let the system work." Clara wanted to believe him. But she'd seen too much corruption, too many powerful men sliding out of consequences to trust that justice would actually happen. They stayed in Denver for another week while the trial dragged on. The federal government had put them up in a boarding house on the edge of town, clean, safe, boring. Clara spent her days in court and her evenings staring at walls, waiting for the verdict that would determine whether the past 4 months of hell had meant anything. Riker was restless too. She could see it in the way he paced their small room, in how he checked his guns even though there was no threat here, no reason to be armed. He was a man built for action being forced to sit still, and it was eating at him. "You could leave," Clara said one evening, watching him clean his pistol for the 3rd time that day. "You don't have to stay for the verdict." "Where would I go?" "Wherever marshals go when they're not babysitting witnesses." She tried to make it sound light, teasing, but it came out bitter instead. Riker set down the gun and looked at her. "Is that what you think I'm doing? Babysitting? Aren't you? Your job was to protect me until the trial. Trial's almost over. Then what?" "Then we figure out what comes next." "What if there is no next?" Clara stood up, the frustration she'd been holding in for days finally spilling over. "What if Webb walks and we're right back where we started, except now everyone knows my face and my name from the newspapers? What if we spent 4 months running and fighting and nearly dying, and it all meant nothing?" "It meant something," Riker said quietly. "What? What did it mean?" "It meant you're still alive." He crossed to where she stood, his eyes serious. "It meant those documents got into the right hands. It meant Hetch's organization took a hit they won't recover from, even if Webb slips through. And it meant—" He stopped, jaw tight. "What?" "It meant I found something worth fighting for besides just the next job." Clara's breath caught. They'd been dancing around this for months. The fact that their marriage had started as a desperate bargain, but had become something else through shared danger and survival. She'd felt it in the way he looked at her, in the kiss he'd given her before the canyon battle, in how he stayed even when he could have left. A knock on the door interrupted whatever she'd been about to say. Riker answered it, hand automatically going to where his gun would have been if he'd been wearing it. A young man in a federal courier uniform stood there, holding an envelope. "Message for Marshal Vale. Judge Hartwell wants you both at the courthouse immediately. Jury's reached a verdict." They made the walk to the courthouse in silence, Clara's heart hammering against her ribs. Too fast. The jury had only been deliberating for 6 hours. That couldn't be good. Quick verdicts usually meant not guilty, meant the jury hadn't even seriously considered the evidence. The courtroom was already packed when they arrived, every seat filled with reporters and spectators hungry for the outcome. Webb sat at the defense table looking calm, almost pleased. His lawyers were smiling. Clara felt sick. Judge Hartwell entered and everyone stood. The formalities dragged on, the jury filing in, the foreman being identified, the question being asked. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find?" The foreman, a dry goods merchant with a forgettable face, looked down at the paper in his hands. "We find the defendant, Marcus Webb, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Clara grabbed Riker's arm to keep from collapsing as relief crashed through her. The foreman kept reading, guilty on racketeering, guilty on orchestrating criminal enterprise, guilty on attempted murder, guilty on every single charge. Webb's face went white. His lawyers were already objecting, calling for mistrials, citing procedural errors. But Judge Hartwell banged his gavel, and the sound cut through the chaos like a gunshot. "Marcus Webb, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 17 separate charges. Sentencing will be held 1 week from today, but I can tell you now, you will spend the rest of your natural life in federal prison. Bailiff, remove the prisoner." They had to drag Webb out. He was screaming about corruption, about how the trial was rigged, about how his organization would make sure everyone involved paid. But his voice faded as they hauled him through the back door, and then he was gone. Clara stood there in the packed courtroom, reporters shouting questions, people pressing in from all sides, and felt something inside her finally unclench. It was over. Actually, truly over. Riker's hand found hers in the crowd. "Come on, let's get out of here." They pushed through to a side exit, escaping into an alley before the reporters could follow. Clara leaned against the brick wall and started laughing, that same half-hysterical sound from months ago when Riker had first suggested running to Oregon. "We did it," she said between gasps. "We actually did it." "You did it." Riker was watching her with something soft in his expression. You testified. You faced him down. That took courage. I was terrified the entire time. Courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing it anyway. Clara looked at him. This dangerous, scarred man who'd saved her life so many times she'd lost count, who'd become her husband in name and was slowly becoming something more in reality. What happens now? Now we decide where we go, what we do. He hesitated. If you want to stay married or get it annulled, your choice. The question she'd been avoiding for months, laid out plain and simple. Clara thought about it. Thought about the woman she'd been in that Nebraska courtroom, desperate and powerless, and willing to accept anything to survive. She wasn't that woman anymore. The trail had changed her, hardened her, shown her she was capable of things she'd never imagined. And Riker had been there through all of it, not controlling her, not making decisions for her, just standing beside her, steady and solid, letting her become whoever she needed to be. I don't want an annulment, she said. Something shifted in Riker's face. You sure? You could start fresh somewhere. Find someone who doesn't come with a dangerous job and a past full of violence. I could, or I could stay with the man who looks at me like I'm worth protecting, worth standing beside. Claire stepped closer to him. I'm not saying I love you, not yet, but I think I could, given time. Time I can give you. Riker's good hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. As much as you need. He kissed her then, there in the alley behind the courthouse, and it was different from the desperate kiss before the canyon battle. This one was slower, deeper, full of possibility instead of desperation. When they finally pulled apart, Clara was breathless. So what do we do? Where do we go? I've been thinking about that. Riker leaned against the wall beside her. Marshal Garrett offered me a permanent position, based out of Portland, working criminal cases across the Oregon and Washington territories. You want to take it? Depends. You willing to settle in Portland? It's a growing city, rough but getting civilized. Good place to start over. Clara considered it. She'd lost everything in Nebraska. Her farm, her old life, any connection to who she used to be. But maybe that wasn't a loss. Maybe it was freedom. Portland, she said. All right, let's go to Portland. They left Denver 3 days later on a train heading west. Clara watched the mountains slide past the window and thought about how much distance she'd covered in the past 5 months. Physically across the frontier, but also internally, becoming someone she barely recognized. Stronger, harder, less willing to let the world tell her what she was worth. Riker dozed beside her, his shoulder still healing, his hand resting on hers. They'd survived together. Maybe they could build something together too. Portland in 1869 was a muddy, chaotic port city clinging to the edge of the wilderness. Rain fell almost constantly, turning the streets into rivers of muck that ruined Clara's boots within a week. But there was energy here, possibility, people streaming in from everywhere trying to build new lives. Marshal Garrett met them at the station, looking older than he had back in Harlan, but pleased to see them alive. Vale, Mrs. Vale, welcome to civilization, such as it is. It's perfect, Clara said, meaning it. The mud and rain and chaos were honest, at least. Nobody here cared who she'd been or what she'd survived. She was just another person trying to make a life. Garrett got them set up in a small house on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it had real walls and a roof that didn't leak and a bed that didn't require sleeping in a wagon. Clara stood in the empty front room and tried to imagine filling it with furniture, with life, with something that felt like home. We'll need to get you proper supplies, Garrett was saying to Riker. New weapons, ammunition, maps of the territory. I've got 3 active cases that could use your attention, but I'll give you a few weeks to settle in first. No need. Riker was examining the house with the same tactical assessment he applied to everything. I can start whenever you need me. Your shoulder will heal faster if I'm working instead of sitting around getting soft. Garrett laughed, spoken like a man who doesn't know how to rest. All right, come by the office tomorrow and I'll brief you on what we're dealing with. After he left, Claire and Riker stood in the empty house, listening to rain drum on the roof. It's not much, Riker said. It's more than I had 4 months ago. Claire walked to the window, looking out at the muddy street. You really going to take those cases? Jump right back into danger? It's what I do. I know. I'm just... She turned to face him. I'm just getting used to the idea that you might actually come home at night instead of getting shot at. Can't promise I won't get shot at, but I'll always come home. He crossed to her, his good arm wrapping around her waist. If that's what you want. It is. Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. But I'm not going to sit here worrying every time you walk out the door. I need something to do, something that's mine. What do you want? Clara thought about it. Back in Nebraska, she'd been a farmer's wife, defined entirely by her relationship to Thomas. She didn't want to be just a marshal's wife now, defined by Riker. She wanted to be her own person. I want to help people, she said slowly. Women, specifically. The ones who end up in situations like I was in, desperate, trapped, with no good options. I want to give them choices. Riker pulled back to look at her. Like a charitable organization? Maybe. Or maybe something more practical. A place where women can learn skills, find work, get legal help if they need it. The idea was forming as she spoke, getting clearer. There are a lot of women coming to Portland with nothing. I could help them. You could? Riker smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look younger. You'd be good at it. You think so? I know so. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Clara. You just needed someone to show you that. Clara felt her throat tighten. I'm not strong. I'm just stubborn. Same thing, usually. She laughed and kissed him, and for the first time in months felt like maybe they'd actually made it. Maybe they'd actually survived. The next morning, Riker left early for the marshal's office. Clara spent the day exploring Portland, getting a feel for the city and its people. She found boarding houses full of women working as seamstresses, laundresses, cooks, honest work but barely paying enough to survive. She found saloons where women worked in less honest ways, their eyes hollow with the kind of desperation Clara recognized. She also found resistance. When she started asking about renting space for her proposed organization, landlords quoted prices 3 times what they charged men. When she inquired about getting legal standing to help women in distress, lawyers laughed at her. A woman running a charitable organization? Unheard of. Improper. She should be home supporting her husband's career, not gallivanting around trying to change the world. Clara smiled politely and kept pushing. She'd survived Marcus Webb. She could survive bureaucratic nonsense. It took 6 months to get everything organized. 6 months of fighting for permits, for funding, for basic respect from people who thought women belonged in kitchens and not much else. But Clara was relentless, and eventually the city council approved her application for the Women's Aid Society of Portland, an organization providing legal assistance, job training, and emergency housing for women in crisis. Riker helped when he could, between the cases Garrett assigned him. Clara learned to read the signs of his work, the days he came home with new bruises, the nights he cleaned his guns in grim silence, the mornings he left before dawn without saying where he was going. It was dangerous work, tracking criminals across rough territory, but he was good at it, and it gave him purpose. They built a life. Strange, unconventional, nothing like what Clara had imagined back in Nebraska. But it was theirs. Then, 8 months after they'd settled in Portland, everything threatened to fall apart again. Clara was at the Aid Society office, helping a young woman fill out paperwork for a divorce from an abusive husband when a federal courier arrived with an urgent message for her. She read it twice, her hands starting to shake. Marcus Webb had escaped from prison, killed 2 guards and disappeared into the frontier. Authorities believed he was heading west, possibly toward Portland. All witnesses from his trial were advised to take immediate precautions. Clara dismissed the woman she'd been helping and locked the office door with trembling fingers. Webb. After all this time, he was still a threat, still hunting her. She ran home and found Riker already there, loading ammunition into gun belts with mechanical precision. He looked up when she entered, his face grim. "You heard," she said. "Garrett sent word an hour ago. Webb's got help. Someone broke him out, probably remnants of the organization trying to salvage what they can by eliminating witnesses." Riker checked his pistols, spinning the cylinders to make sure they moved smoothly. "He'll come for you. It's personal now." "So what do we do, run again?" "No." Riker's voice was flat, certain. "No more running. We end this permanently." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we don't wait for Webb to find us. We find him first. Riker looked at her steadily. I've got contacts who can track his movements. We hunt him down and we finish this before he gets anywhere near Portland. That's suicide. You're still healing from the last fight, and Webb will have men with him. Then we get our own help. Garrett can authorize a federal posse. We'll have numbers on our side this time. Riker crossed to her, his hands finding her shoulders. I'm not letting him take you from me. I'm not letting him destroy what we've built here. This ends now. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say there had to be another way. But she knew Riker was right. Webb wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. Better to control the confrontation than wait for him to choose the time and place. All right, she said, we hunt him, but I'm coming with you. Clara, don't even try to convince me to stay behind. You taught me to shoot, to survive, to fight. I'm not sitting in Portland waiting to hear if you're alive or dead. She held his gaze. We do this together or not at all. Riker looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him. Together, he agreed. But you follow my lead. We do this smart, not reckless. They spent 2 days preparing. Garrett assembled a posse, 6 experienced federal marshals, all of them with combat experience. Clara practiced with her rifle until her shoulder ached, reviewed tactical plans with Riker until she understood every contingency. Riker's contacts reported that Webb was holed up in an abandoned trading post about 60 miles east of Portland, gathering resources and men for his assault on the city. He had maybe a dozen fighters with him, enough to be dangerous but not overwhelming if the posse struck fast and coordinated. They left Portland before dawn on a gray morning that threatened rain. Clara rode beside Riker, her rifle across her saddle, her stomach a knot of fear and determination. The other marshals treated her with wary respect. They'd all heard about the canyon battle, about how she'd fought beside Riker against Webb's men and survived. The abandoned trading post sat in a clearing surrounded by thick forest. They approached from 3 sides, spreading out to encircle the building before Webb's sentries could sound an alarm. Clara took position with Riker on the north side, hidden in the tree line, watching the building for signs of movement. Remember the plan, Riker whispered. We go in fast, we secure Webb alive if possible, and we don't take unnecessary risks. Define unnecessary, Clara muttered. He almost smiled. Anything that might get you killed. The signal came, a sharp whistle from Garrett's position. They moved as one, the posse breaking from cover and rushing the trading post from all sides. Clara ran with her rifle ready, her heart hammering, every sense heightened. Webb's men opened fire immediately. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood, kicking up dirt. Clara threw herself behind cover and returned fire, her shots deliberate and controlled like Riker had taught her. The battle was chaos but coordinated chaos. The marshals had done this before, knew how to work together, how to provide covering fire while others advanced. Clara moved when Riker moved, shot when he shot, trusted him to keep her alive the way he always had. They breached the building through the back entrance, clearing rooms systematically. Clara's hands were steady on her rifle, even though her heart was trying to beat out of her chest. They found Webb's men, but not Webb himself. He'd already fled through a tunnel that led to the forest. "He's running!" one of the marshals shouted. Riker was already moving, sprinting toward the tunnel exit. Clara followed, ignoring the voice in her head screaming that this was exactly the kind of unnecessary risk Riker had warned against. They emerged from the tunnel into thick forest, the trees so dense the morning light barely penetrated. Riker stopped, listening, his whole body tense. Clara could hear it too, someone crashing through the underbrush ahead, not bothering with stealth anymore. They gave chase. Clara's lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but she kept running. She could see Webb now, maybe 30 yards ahead, his expensive suit torn and muddy, his face twisted with desperation and rage. He turned and fired wildly behind him. The bullet went wide but made Riker and Clara dive for cover. By the time they looked up, Webb had disappeared into the dense undergrowth. "Split up," Riker said. "I'll circle left, you go right. Flush him toward the clearing ahead." "Bad idea," Clara said, breathing hard. "We should stay together." "No time, he'll get away." Before she could argue, Riker was moving left through the trees. Clara swore under her breath and went right, her rifle ready, every nerve screaming danger. She found him near a creek bed. Marcus Webb, cornered, his gun raised but his hand shaking. Blood stained his shoulder where someone had winged him during the fight at the trading post. He looked older than Clara remembered, more desperate, A man watching his empire crumble to nothing. "Mrs. Vale," he said, and tried to smile. "We meet again." Clara kept her rifle trained on his chest. "It's over, Webb. Your men are dead or captured. You've got nowhere to run." "I've always got somewhere to run." But even as he said it, his gun arm wavered. "Though I suppose I'm tired of running, tired of this whole business." "Then put down the gun and surrender." "To what? Life in a cell?" "No, thank you." Webb's expression hardened. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. At least then I'll have accomplished something." His finger tightened on the trigger. Clara fired first. The shot took Webb in the chest, dead center, and he went down hard. His gun fell from his hand as he collapsed backward into the creek bed, blood spreading across his expensive shirt, his eyes wide with surprise. Clara lowered her rifle with shaking hands and walked closer. Webb was still breathing, barely, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. He coughed, more blood. "You've got steel in you after all." "You made me find it," Clara said quietly. Riker appeared from the trees, gun drawn, scanning for threats. When he saw Webb on the ground, he relaxed slightly and moved to Clara's side. "You okay?" "I killed him." Clara's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "I shot him. In self-defense. He was about to kill you." "I know, She looked down at Webb, watching the life drain out of his eyes. "I thought I'd feel different. Relieved, maybe. Triumphant. But I just feel tired." Webb's breathing stopped. His eyes went blank, staring at nothing. The man who'd hunted them for months, who'd killed so many people trying to protect his empire, was dead in a muddy creek bed in the middle of nowhere. It felt anticlimactic. Garrett and the other marshals arrived minutes later, securing the scene, confirming that Webb's remaining men had been captured or killed. The threat was finally, truly over. They burned the trading post to the ground and rode back to Portland with Webb's body tied across a horse. Clara rode in silence, processing what she'd done, what it meant. She'd taken a life. Justified, necessary, but still a weight she'd carry forever. Riker stayed close but didn't push her to talk. He understood, she realized. He'd carried that same weight for years. The newspapers went wild with the story. The frontier widow who'd helped bring down a criminal empire had now killed its leader in a final showdown. They made Clara into a legend she didn't want to be, a symbol of women's strength and courage that felt false and hollow. But in Portland, among the women she helped at the Aid Society, Clara became something else. She became proof that you could survive the worst and still build something good. That you could face down evil and come through the other side changed, but not broken. 6 months after Webb's death, Clara stood in the Aid Society office and looked at the ledger showing how many women they'd helped. 73 in the past year. 73 women who'd walked in desperate and walked out with options, with skills, with hope. It wasn't enough, would never be enough. But it was something. Riker came home that evening with a new scar on his jaw and a report about a successful arrest in the mountains. Clara patched him up at their kitchen table, her hands steady, familiar with this routine now. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked, dabbing antiseptic on the wound. "Finding a safer line of work? Every time I get shot at." He winced as the antiseptic burned. "But then I think about what would happen if someone like me wasn't out there stopping people like Webb, and I keep going." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." He caught her hand, pressing it against his scarred cheek. "What about you? You could step back from the Aid Society, let someone else run it." "And do what? Sit home and worry about you getting killed?" Clara shook her head. "No, we both keep doing what we're doing. We both keep fighting in our own ways. Even if it's hard?" "Especially because it's hard." She leaned down and kissed him, tasting copper and antiseptic. "We didn't survive everything we survived just to give up now." They built their life in Portland over the next year, strange, difficult, often dangerous, but theirs. Clara's Aid Society grew. Riker's work with the Marshals continued. They fought, they struggled, they learned to be partners in every sense, and slowly, carefully, they learned to be happy. One evening, sitting on their porch watching rain fall over the city, Riker said, "I love you." It was the first time he'd said it. Clara turned to look at him, at this scarred, dangerous man who'd saved her life and then given her space to save herself. "I love you too," she said, and meant it completely. He smiled, that rare, transforming smile that made him look almost young. Took you long enough to figure that out. Took you longer to say it. Fair point. Clara leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and watched the rain fall on Portland. Somewhere out there, new threats were building, new dangers forming. But for this moment, in this place, they were safe. They were together. They were home. The baby came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 years after Clara and Riker had settled in Portland. She arrived screaming and red-faced and completely furious at being born, which Clara decided was appropriate given everything her daughter would inherit from her parents. "She's got your lungs," Riker said, cradling the tiny bundle with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands were more familiar with guns than infants. "She's got your temper," Clara countered, exhausted but smiling. "Look at that scowl." They named her Sarah, after the wagon master's wife who'd given birth on the trail and shown Clara that women could be strong in ways that had nothing to do with violence. Sarah Margaret Vale, daughter of a federal marshal and a woman who'd killed a crime boss in self-defense. Poor kid didn't stand a chance at a normal life. Clara had discovered she was pregnant 6 months earlier, right in the middle of negotiating with the city council for expanded funding for the Aid Society. The timing was terrible. The pregnancy was unplanned, and Clara had spent the first week after confirmation alternating between panic and a strange, fierce joy she didn't quite know how to process. "You don't have to keep it," the doctor had said carefully. "Given your circumstances, no one would judge." I'm keeping her," Clara had interrupted, certain in a way she couldn't explain. "Whatever happens, I'm keeping her." Riker had taken the news with his typical stoic calm, though Clara caught him that evening sitting on their porch staring at nothing, his expression somewhere between terrified and awed. "You all right?" she'd asked. "I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be a mother. We'll figure it out together." Now, holding Sarah while Riker watched with that same awed terror on his face, Clara felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a physical thing. This tiny person would depend on them completely, would learn from them, grow because of them, become whoever she became partly because of the choices Clara and Riker made. It was terrifying. The Aid Society continued operating through Clara's pregnancy and after, though she had to delegate more responsibilities to the women she'd trained. Margaret Chen had moved to Portland a year earlier after her husband died, and she ran the day-to-day operations with competent efficiency that let Clara focus on the bigger picture. Fundraising, political advocacy, expansion plans. They were helping more women now, nearly 200 in the past year. Victims of domestic violence, widows facing debt, young women escaping forced marriages or worse. Clara saw herself in every one of them, saw the desperation, the fear, the feeling of being trapped with no good options. And she gave them what Riker had given her that day in the courthouse. Choice. Not always easy choices, not always good ones, but choices nonetheless, which was more than they'd had before walking through the Aid Society's doors. "You're changing the world," Margaret told her one afternoon, watching Clara nurse Sarah while simultaneously reviewing budget reports. One woman at a time. "I'm making a dent," Clara corrected. "The world's too big to change all at once." A dent's still something. Riker's work hadn't slowed down. If anything, Portland's growth brought new problems. Smuggling operations, claim jumpers, gangs targeting Chinese immigrants who couldn't fight back without risking deportation. He came home with fresh scars regularly, each one adding to the map of violence written across his body. Clara hated it. Hated the fear that grabbed her throat every time he left for a job. Hated the nights she lay awake listening for his footsteps, wondering if this would be the time he didn't come home. But she also understood it. Riker needed purpose the way most people needed air, and his purpose was stopping bad people from hurting innocents. "You could retire," she suggested one evening after he'd come home with cracked ribs from a fight with a gang in Chinatown. "We've got enough saved. You don't have to keep doing this." "And do what instead?" He was stretched out on their bed while Clara carefully wrapped his ribs. "Sit around getting soft while people suffer?" "You could help at the Aid Society. We need security sometimes, men trying to intimidate women into dropping legal cases." "That's not the same." He caught her hand, stopping her wrapping. "I know you worry. I know this is hard on you, but if I stop being who I am, and I don't know how to be anyone else." Clara understood that too. She'd become someone new after leaving Nebraska, stronger, harder, more certain of her own worth. But that person was built on the foundation of everything she'd survived, everything she'd fought through. Take that away, and she wouldn't know who she was either. Just try not to die, she said finally. I'll do my best. Sarah grew fast, all chubby legs and dark hair that stuck up in every direction despite Clara's attempts to tame it. She was walking by 10 months, talking by 14, and causing chaos by 16. Riker was surprisingly good with her, patient in ways he wasn't with adults, willing to sit for hours answering her endless questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Because of how sunlight scatters through the atmosphere. What's mosphere? The air around the Earth. Why is there air? Because otherwise we couldn't breathe. Why do we breathe? Clara watched these exchanges with amusement, seeing a side of Riker she suspected few people ever witnessed. The dangerous federal marshal became just a father trying to explain the world to his curious daughter. But the world they were explaining wasn't safe. Portland was growing, which meant growing pains, corruption in the city government, violent crime in the expanding slums, tensions between different immigrant communities competing for the same limited resources. The aid society's work became more urgent and more dangerous. Clara started receiving threats. Anonymous letters warning her to stop helping Chinese women escape brothels, to stop defending Native women against land theft, to stop making trouble for powerful men who'd rather keep exploiting vulnerable populations. She brought the letters to Riker, who read them with a carefully blank expression that meant he was furious. You need protection, he said. I'm not hiding. These women need help. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm telling you to be smart. He pulled out one of his pistols and set it on the table between them. You know how to use this. Start carrying it. Clara stared at the weapon. She'd killed Marcus Webb 3 years ago, had shot other men during the canyon battle and the wagon train attack. But those were survival situations, desperate moments where it was kill or be killed. Carrying a gun daily felt different. Felt like admitting the violence would never really end. All right, she said finally. I'll carry it. She started wearing the pistol in a holster under her jacket, hidden but accessible. Some of the women at the Aid Society noticed and understood. Others looked at her differently, like she'd crossed some invisible line between helper and fighter. Maybe she had. The threats escalated to action on a cold November evening when Clara was leaving the Aid Society office late. 3 men were waiting in the alley, their faces covered, their intentions clear. Clara's hand went to her pistol, but one of them was faster, grabbing her wrist and slamming her against the brick wall hard enough to make her vision blur. You don't listen well, the man hissed. His breath smelled like whiskey and rot. We warned you to stop interfering. Clara kneed him in his groin with everything she had. He doubled over and she shoved past, running for the street, her hand finally closing around the pistol grip. But the other 2 were blocking her path, and she realized with cold clarity that she wasn't getting out of this alley without fighting. She drew the pistol and fired once into the air. The shot echoed off the buildings like thunder, and suddenly windows were opening, people were shouting, and her attackers were running. Clara stood there shaking, the gun still raised, until Riker appeared from somewhere running at full speed. Clara, what happened? They were waiting for me, trying to, I don't know, scare me, hurt me, maybe worse. She lowered the gun with trembling hands. I fired a warning shot. Riker's face went through several expressions before settling on controlled fury. Did you see their faces? No, they were covered. He swore viciously and pulled her into his arms, and Clara let herself shake against his chest for a moment before pulling herself together. She couldn't fall apart. Not here. Not where the women she helped might see her weakness and lose faith. We're moving the Aid Society to a new location, Riker said, somewhere more secure, more visible, and you're getting a permanent escort when you work late. I don't need... Yes, you do. And if you argue with me about this, I swear I'll lock you in our house and stand guard myself. His arms tightened around her. I can't lose you, Clara. I won't. She heard the fear under his anger and stopped arguing. They were partners. That meant protecting each other, even when pride suggested otherwise. The Aid Society moved to a new building near the federal courthouse, with better lighting and federal marshals stationed nearby. Clara hired 2 women who'd grown up rough and knew how to handle themselves in a fight. The threats didn't stop, but the attackers were more cautious now, less willing to risk direct confrontation. Meanwhile, Sarah was growing up in a household that was anything but normal. By the time she was 5, she could load a rifle and knew what to do if strangers approached the house. She'd also inherited Clara's stubborn streak and Riker's temper, which made for explosive tantrums that left both parents exhausted. "She's impossible," Clara said one evening after Sarah had screamed for an hour about not wanting to wear shoes. "She's like you," Riker said, almost smiling. "Strong-willed, won't back down. It'll serve her well when she's older." "If we survive until she's older." But Clara loved her daughter with a fierceness that sometimes scared her. Loved watching Sarah grow into her own person, confident and loud and completely unafraid of the world. This was what Clara had fought for, not just her own freedom, but the freedom of the next generation to be whoever they needed to be. Years passed. The AIDS Society expanded to 3 locations across Portland. Clara's reputation grew, the frontier widow who'd become a force for change, who'd faced down criminals and corrupt officials with equal determination. Politicians courted her endorsement. Newspapers interviewed her about women's rights and social reform. She hated the attention but used it anyway, leveraging her fame to get funding and legal changes that helped the women who needed it most. Riker kept working, kept getting shot at, kept coming home with new scars. Sarah learned to patch him up by the time she was 8, her small hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned wounds and applied bandages while lecturing him about being more careful. "You sound like your mother," Riker told her. "Mama's usually right," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Clara felt something warm in her chest watching them together. This strange family they'd built from violence and desperation and survival had become something real, something good. Not perfect. They fought, they struggled, they carried scars both visible and invisible, but they were theirs. When Sarah was 12, Clara took her to visit the AIDS Society, showed her the women who came through seeking help, explained what the organization did and why it mattered. Sarah listened with serious eyes, taking in everything. "These women are like you were," she said afterward, "before you met Papa." "Yes. And you helped them because you remember what it felt like." "I helped them because everyone deserves choices," Clara corrected. "Because being desperate doesn't make you worthless, and needing help doesn't make you weak." Sarah considered this. "When I'm grown, I want to help too." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Then I'll teach you everything I know." The years continued their relentless march. Clara's hair started showing gray. Riker's scars multiplied. Sarah grew into a fierce, brilliant young woman who argued with everyone and backed down from nothing. The AIDS Society helped thousands of women across 2 decades of operation, providing legal aid, job training, emergency housing, and the kind of practical support that changed lives. Clara watched it all happen and felt satisfied in a way she never had back in Nebraska. That farm life had been someone else's dream, Thomas's dream, and she'd just been along for the ride. This, the AIDS Society, the women she helped, the family she'd built with Riker, this was her dream, her choice, her life. Riker retired from active marshal duty when he turned 55, his body finally giving him no choice after 1 too many bullets and broken bones. He hated it at first, restless and irritable, until Clara pointed out that the AIDS Society could use his expertise training women in self-defense. He started teaching classes twice a week, showing vulnerable women how to fight back, how to escape bad situations, how to survive. "You're still doing the same work," Clara told him, watching him demonstrate escape holds to a room full of attentive students. "Just differently. It's not the same." "No, it's better. You're preventing violence instead of just responding to it." He grumbled but kept teaching, and Clara saw him slowly adjust to this new role. Saw him find satisfaction in seeing women walk out of his classes standing taller, more confident, more certain of their own strength. Sarah left for college in San Francisco when she was 18, studying law with the intention of becoming the kind of lawyer who defended people who couldn't afford proper representation. Clara watched her daughter board the train and felt pride mixed with the ache of letting go. "She'll be fine," Riker said, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "I know. I remember being her age. Remember how much I didn't know about the world. She knows more than you did. You made sure of that." That was true. Sarah had grown up understanding that women could be strong, could fight, could make their own choices. She'd never experienced the kind of powerlessness Clara had felt standing in that Nebraska courthouse. That was Clara's gift to her daughter, a different beginning. The AIDS Society celebrated its 25th anniversary when Clara was 59 years old. They threw a reception at the main office, inviting all the women who'd passed through over the years. Hundreds came. Women who'd escaped abusive marriages, who'd found jobs and independence, who'd built new lives from the ashes of their old ones. They brought children, grandchildren, stories of survival and success. Margaret Chen, now 74 and still sharp as ever, gave a speech about how Clara had changed Portland's landscape for women, had made the city a place where being desperate didn't mean being doomed. 25 years ago, one woman decided that her own survival wasn't enough, Margaret said, looking directly at Clara. She decided that every woman deserved the choice she'd been given. And she spent the next quarter century making that happen, one person at a time. The room erupted in applause. Clara stood there feeling embarrassed and proud and overwhelmed, seeing the faces of all these women she'd helped, all these lives she'd touched. Riker squeezed her hand. "You did this." "We did this," she corrected. That night, lying in bed beside him, Clara thought about the woman she'd been at 34, desperate, powerless, convinced she was worthless because that's what everyone had told her. She thought about everything that had happened since, all the violence and fear and struggle, but also all the growth and strength and purpose she'd found. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Riker. "That day in the courthouse. Marrying me. Never. Best impulsive decision I ever made." He turned to face her in the darkness. "What about you?" Clara thought about it honestly. "I regret the pain, the people who died, the things we had to do to survive. But the outcome? The life we built? No, I don't regret that." Good. They lay in comfortable silence, two people who'd survived impossible odds and built something meaningful from the wreckage. Outside, Portland hummed with life. A city they'd helped shape, in small ways, through their work. Riker died quietly in his sleep 2 years later, at 64, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of violence and stress. Clara woke up beside him and knew immediately, the way you know things when you've shared a bed with someone for over 30 years. She sat there for a long time, holding his scarred hand, crying quietly for the dangerous, complicated man who'd saved her life and then given her space to save herself. Sarah came home for the funeral, along with her husband and 2 young daughters Clara barely knew. The service was packed. Federal marshals, women from the Aid Society, people Riker had helped over 3 decades of work. They told stories Clara had never heard, about lives saved and criminals stopped and quiet acts of heroism that Riker had never mentioned because he wasn't the type to seek recognition. "Your father was a good man," Clara told her granddaughters, both of them too young to really understand death, but old enough to sense loss. "A hard man sometimes, but good where it mattered." After the funeral, Sarah asked if Clara wanted to come to San Francisco, live with her family instead of staying alone in Portland. "I'm not alone," Clara said. "I have the Aid Society. I have work to do." "Mama, you're 61 years old. You've been working for 30 years. You're allowed to rest." "I'll rest when I'm dead." Clara softened her tone. "I appreciate the offer, sweetheart, but this is my home, my life. I'm not ready to give it up." Sarah argued, but eventually accepted it, recognizing her own stubborn streak reflected back at her. She returned to San Francisco with her family, and Clara went back to running the Aid Society alone. Without Riker, the house felt empty in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. She'd gotten used to his presence, the sound of him cleaning guns in the evening, the warmth of him beside her at night, the quiet conversations over breakfast. Now there was just silence and the ghost of 30 years together. But Clara didn't collapse, didn't break down. She grieved, deeply and privately, but she kept working, kept helping women who walked through the Aid Society's doors carrying the same desperate fear she'd carried so long ago. The work gave her purpose, gave her reason to get up every morning instead of drowning in loss. She ran the Aid Society for another 15 years, watching it grow beyond Portland to Seattle and Spokane and Eugene. Margaret Chen died at 80, and Clara spoke at her funeral about friendship forged on the Oregon Trail and maintained through decades of shared work. More women came, more lives were changed, more victories were won in courtrooms and city councils. Clara's hair went completely white. Her hands developed arthritis that made writing difficult. Her eyes needed glasses for reading. But she kept going, because what else was there? She'd spent 40 years building something that mattered. Stopping now felt like betrayal. When she was 76, a young reporter from the Portland Chronicle came to interview her about the Aid Society's 40th anniversary. The woman was fresh out of college, eager and naive and full of questions about Clara's famous story. "Is it true you were forced to marry in a courthouse?" she asked. "Yes." "And your husband paid your debts to save you?" "Yes." "That must have been terrifying." Clara thought about it. It was. But it was also the first time in my life someone gave me a real choice. Not a perfect choice, but a choice. And that made all the difference. Do you have advice for women facing impossible situations today? Clara considered the question carefully. She thought about that desperate woman in the Nebraska courthouse, about all the desperate women who'd walked through the Aid Society's doors over 4 decades, about her granddaughters growing up in a world that was better but still not equal. "Don't let anyone make you feel small," she said finally. "Not men who think you're property, not circumstances that seem impossible, not even yourself when fear tells you to give up. You're stronger than you know, and you deserve choices. Always remember that." The reporter wrote it down like scripture, and Clara felt old and tired and strangely hopeful. The work would continue. Other women would pick up where she left off. The Aid Society would outlive her, helping women for generations to come. She stepped down as director when she was 78. Her body finally insisting on rest. A younger woman took over, brilliant, fierce, reminded Clara of herself at that age. Clara attended the board meetings when she could, offered advice when asked, but mostly let the new generation lead. Sarah visited more often now, bringing the granddaughters who were growing into their own strength. They asked questions about Clara's life, about the famous story everyone knew, the courtroom bride who'd become a frontier legend. "Were you scared?" the older granddaughter asked. "Constantly," Clara admitted, "but I did what needed doing anyway." "That's bravery," the younger one said, like she'd discovered something profound. "No, sweetness. That's just survival. Bravery comes later when you choose to keep fighting even after you're safe." On a cold morning in March, when Clara was 82, she woke up knowing something had changed. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. She wasn't afraid. She'd faced death enough times to recognize it approaching, but she felt sad. There was still so much work to do, so many women who needed help. But maybe that was the point. The work was never finished. There would always be someone struggling, someone desperate, someone who needed choices. Clara had done her part. Now it was someone else's turn. She made it to her favorite chair by the window, the one overlooking the garden she'd built in Riker's memory. The morning light was beautiful, turning the rain on the glass into diamonds. Clara thought about everything: the courthouse, the wagon train, the canyon battle, the decades of work, the family she'd built, the lives she'd touched. She thought about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become, and felt satisfied. When Sarah found her later that day, Clara was still sitting in her chair, her face peaceful, her hands folded in her lap. On the table beside her was a letter written in Clara's shaky handwriting. "To my daughters, granddaughters, and all the women who come after. I was nobody special, just a woman who refused to break when the world tried to make me. I survived by learning that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you build through every hard choice, every act of defiance, every moment you stand up instead of falling down. You have that same strength in you. Use it. Fight for your choices. Help others fight for theirs. And never, ever let anyone convince you that you're small. You're not. You never were. With love, Clara." The funeral was massive. Women from across 3 states came to pay respects to the woman who'd helped shape their lives. The Aid Society's current director read Clara's letter aloud, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. They buried her next to Riker in the cemetery overlooking Portland, the city they'd helped build into a place where desperate women could find hope. Sarah planted roses around the grave, tough frontier roses that could survive anything, just like her mother had. The Aid Society continued its work, expanding to 15 locations across the western states. They renamed it the Clara Vale Women's Aid Society, and generations of women who'd never met Clara still heard her story, still drew strength from knowing that someone who'd started with nothing had built something that mattered. 50 years after her death, Clara's great-great-granddaughter stood in what was now the Clara Vale Women's Aid Society headquarters in Portland, looking at the portrait of her ancestor hanging in the main hall. The woman in the painting looked strong, certain, Nothing like the desperate widow from the courthouse story everyone knew. Who was she really? The girl asked her grandmother. She was someone who learned that being powerless is only temporary if you refuse to accept it, came the answer. She was someone who turned survival into purpose, and she was someone who understood that the best way to honor your own freedom is to help others find theirs. The girl studied the portrait, seeing something of herself in Clara's painted eyes. Somewhere in her bloodline was the same stubborn strength, the same refusal to break, the same fierce determination to make choices matter. Tell me the story again, she said. The real one. And so the story was told again, passed down through generations, changed and embellished and simplified, but always carrying the same core truth, that one woman's choice to fight instead of surrender had rippled out across decades, changing lives, building institutions, proving that strength could be found even in the most desperate circumstances. Clara's story became legend, the kind mothers told daughters about what women could be if they refused to accept what the world said they were. But the real legacy wasn't the legend. It was the women who still walked through the aid society's doors, still found help and hope and choices where none had existed before. It was the knowledge that Clara had built something bigger than herself, something that would outlive her by generations, something that proved one person could make a difference if they were stubborn enough to try. It was the simple, powerful truth she'd learned in that Nebraska courthouse and carried with her until her final breath, that being given a choice, even a hard one, was the first step toward freedom, and that once you found that freedom, the only thing worth doing was helping others find theirs. The work continued, the story persisted, and Clara's words, "Never let anyone make you feel small," echoed across 150 years, reaching women who needed to hear them, giving them strength to face their own impossible choices. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the violence, or the drama, or the frontier legend, but the quiet truth that Clara had lived and breathed and built her life around, that every woman deserved the dignity of choice, the power of her own voice, and the knowledge that she was never as small as the world tried to make her believe. That was Clara's real gift to the future, and it was enough.